Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through the sands of time where we'll explore one of history's most fascinating dynasties together. Tonight, we're traveling to ancient Egypt, but not the Egypt of the pharaohs you might expect. Instead, we'll discover the remarkable story of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty that ruled the land of the Nile for 3 centuries, transforming it into a center of learning and culture that would influence the world forever. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a peaceful escape from your day, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. If this kind of immersive historical storytelling brings you comfort, consider subscribing for more journeys through the quiet corridors of the past. Picture yourself standing on the marble steps of the Great Library of Alexandria on a warm morning in 250 BCE. The Mediterranean breeze carries the scent of papyrus and ink as scholars from across the known world hurry past you, their arms filled with scrolls containing the wisdom of ages. This magnificent structure, rising like a temple to knowledge itself, represents the crown jewel of Ptolemaic Egypt. But to understand how this Greek dynasty came to rule the most ancient of kingdoms, we must first journey back to a dusty road in Babylon, where a young general named Ptolemy walked beside the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. The year was 323 BCE, and Alexander the Great lay dying in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. As his life ebbed away, his vast empire stretched from Macedonia to India, an impossible expanse for any single ruler to govern. Among the generals gathered around his deathbed was Ptolemy, son of Lagus, a man whose calculating mind was already working through the implications of his king's imminent death. Unlike his more impetuous companions, Ptolemy had learned patience during his years serving Alexander. He understood that the greatest prizes often went not to the swiftest, but to the most thoughtful. When Alexander breathed his last, the empire he had built through conquest and charisma faced immediate dissolution. His generals, known to history as the Diadochi, began the complex process of dividing territories that would shape the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. In those tense negotiations, while others argued over Macedonia and Asia, Ptolemy quietly requested Egypt. His companions thought him modest, perhaps even foolish, for choosing what seemed like a distant backwater over the heartland of the empire. They could not have been more wrong. Ptolemy understood what others missed. Egypt was not merely another province, but a land apart, protected by deserts, blessed with the life-giving Nile, and possessed of wealth accumulated over 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. More importantly, it was a kingdom with clearly defined borders, unlike the sprawling territories his rivals would spend decades fighting to control. As he made his way down the ancient road to Memphis, Ptolemy was already envisioning a dynasty that would endure long after the other successor kingdoms had fallen. The Egypt that welcomed its new Macedonian ruler was a land of profound contradictions. Along the Nile, farmers continued their eternal rhythm of planting and harvesting, as their ancestors had done since the time of the pyramids. In Memphis, the ancient capital, Egyptian priests maintained rituals that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history. Yet this was also a land that had known foreign rule before. The Persians had governed Egypt for 2 centuries, and the people had learned to adapt while preserving their essential character. Ptolemy's first challenge was not military conquest, for Alexander had already secured Egypt's submission, but something far more complex: legitimacy. How could a Macedonian general convince the Egyptian people that he was their rightful pharaoh? The answer lay in understanding that Egyptian kingship was not merely political, but deeply religious. The pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus and the son of Ra. In a stroke of genius that revealed his deep understanding of Egyptian culture, Ptolemy arranged for Alexander's body to be brought to Egypt for burial. This was no simple matter of honoring a fallen leader. In Egyptian belief, The presence of Alexander's remains would transfer divine legitimacy to the land itself, and by extension, to its new ruler. The magnificent funeral procession that carried Alexander from Babylon to Egypt was one of the most spectacular displays the ancient world had ever seen, and it announced to all that Ptolemy was the true heir to the conqueror's legacy. But Ptolemy's masterstroke came in his approach to Egyptian religion and culture. Rather than imposing Greek customs wholesale, he presented himself as both pharaoh to his Egyptian subjects and king to his Greek settlers. In the great temple of Ptah at Memphis, he participated in the ancient coronation rituals that had made rulers legitimate for 3,000 years. Egyptian priests anointed him with sacred oils while reciting formulas in hieroglyphs that few Greeks could read. To his Egyptian subjects, he became Ptolemy I, beloved of Ptah, chosen of Ra, pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. Yet in Alexandria, the great city that Alexander had founded at the mouth of the Nile, Ptolemy ruled as a Hellenistic king in the tradition of his Macedonian ancestors. Here, in palaces decorated with Greek columns and filled with Greek art, he held court according to the customs of his homeland. This dual identity would become the defining characteristic of Ptolemaic rule, allowing the dynasty to maintain legitimacy among both Greek and Egyptian populations for 3 centuries. The early years of Ptolemy's reign were marked by constant warfare as the successor kingdoms fought for dominance. From his palace in Alexandria, Ptolemy could hear reports of battles raging across the eastern Mediterranean. His rivals Antigonus and Seleucus carved up Alexander's Asian territories, while Cassander struggled to control Macedonia itself. Yet Egypt's natural defences allowed Ptolemy to choose his battles carefully, intervening only when necessary to protect his borders or secure strategic advantages. During these tumultuous decades, daily life in Egypt gradually adapted to its new rulers. In the Delta region, Greek settlers established new towns with Greek names and Greek customs. These colonists, many of them veterans of Alexander's campaigns, brought with them the agricultural techniques and administrative practices of Macedonia. They cleared new land, introduced new crops, and established workshops that produced goods in Greek styles for Greek markets. Yet the vast majority of Egypt's population remained Egyptian, living in villages along the Nile, where the rhythms of life had changed little since pharaonic times. Each morning, as the sun rose over the eastern desert, farmers would walk to their fields, carrying the same tools their grandfathers had used. They planted wheat and barley when the Nile's floods receded, harvested grain under the scorching summer sun, and paid their taxes to officials who might now speak Greek, but who still demanded the same portion of the crop that Pharaoh's tax collectors had always required. In the great cities, the fusion of Greek and Egyptian cultures created something entirely new. Memphis, the ancient capital, became a cosmopolitan center where Egyptian merchants conducted business with Greek traders in multiple languages. The city's markets overflowed with goods from across the Mediterranean, wine from the Greek islands, purple dye from Phoenicia, ivory from Nubia, and spices from Arabia. Egyptian artisans adapted their traditional techniques to create objects that appealed to Greek tastes, while Greek artists learned to work with Egyptian materials and motifs. Perhaps nowhere was this cultural fusion more apparent than in religion. Ptolemy understood that he could not simply replace Egyptian gods with Greek ones without risking rebellion. Instead, he promoted a syncretic approach that identified Egyptian deities with Greek counterparts. Amun-Ra became associated with Zeus, Hathor with Aphrodite, and Thoth with Hermes. This religious diplomacy reached its culmination in Ptolemy's creation of an entirely new god, Serapis. Serapis was designed to appeal to both Greek and Egyptian sensibilities. His cult combined elements of the Egyptian god Osiris with attributes of Greek deities like Zeus and Dionysus. The magnificent Serapeum in Alexandria became one of the most important religious centers in the Mediterranean world. attracting pilgrims and worshippers from dozens of different cultures. This religious innovation demonstrated Ptolemy's sophisticated understanding that successful rule required not just military power, but cultural creativity. The prosperity that resulted from this careful balance between tradition and innovation was remarkable. Egypt, under the early Ptolemies, became the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean world. The Nile's annual flood continued to provide the agricultural abundance that had made Egypt rich for millennia. But now that wealth was enhanced by Greek commercial networks and administrative efficiency, trade routes that had once carried Egyptian goods only to Nubia and the Levant now extended to Sicily, Spain, and the Black Sea. In Alexandria, the profits from this expanded trade funded projects that would make the city legendary. The Great Library, begun under Ptolemy I and completed under his son, represented an unprecedented attempt to collect all human knowledge in one place. Scholars working in the library's halls could consult texts on mathematics from Babylon, poetry from Athens, medical treatises from Sicily, and astronomical observations from India. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships carrying this diverse cargo safely into Alexandria's harbour. Yet beneath this glittering surface of prosperity and cultural achievement, tensions simmered that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's downfall. The Ptolemies' dual identity as both Greek kings and Egyptian pharaohs required constant balancing that became more difficult with each generation. Egyptian priests, while publicly supportive of their Greek rulers, privately maintained traditions and loyalties that connected them to Egypt's pharaonic past. Greek settlers, meanwhile, often viewed themselves as a superior class destined to rule over the native population. These cultural tensions were compounded by the Ptolemies' peculiar marriage customs. Following the example of the pharaohs, Ptolemaic rulers began marrying their sisters to preserve the purity of their bloodline and concentrate power within the royal family. While this practice was accepted in Egyptian tradition, it created dynastical complications that would plague later generations. Court intrigue, sibling rivalry, and succession disputes became constant features of Ptolemaic rule. As the first Ptolemy aged, he could look back on remarkable achievements. He had transformed a fragment of Alexander's empire into a stable, prosperous kingdom that had successfully defended itself against all challengers. Alexandria had become one of the great cities of the world, rivaling Athens and Rome in importance. Egyptian grain fed much of the Mediterranean, while Egyptian gold and luxury goods enriched trade networks from Spain to India. The morning sun that rose over Alexandria in 283 BCE illuminated a city that embodied the cosmopolitan spirit of the Hellenistic age. In the harbour, ships from dozens of nations unloaded cargo, while their crews marvelled at the towering lighthouse. In the palace district, courtiers speaking Greek, Egyptian, and a dozen other languages navigated the complex protocols of royal administration. And in the library, scholars pursued questions about mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy that would influence human thought for centuries to come. This was the world that Ptolemy I created through patient calculation, cultural sensitivity, and administrative genius. Yet as he prepared to pass his throne to his son, he could not have foreseen how the very success of his innovations would create new challenges for future generations. The wealth and power he had accumulated would make the Ptolemaic kingdom a target for ambitious rivals, while the cultural synthesis he had achieved would prove increasingly difficult to maintain as Greek and Egyptian identities pulled in different directions. The story of how this remarkable dynasty navigated these challenges, reached the heights of power under rulers like Ptolemy III and the legendary Cleopatra VII, and ultimately succumbed to the rising power of Rome, would unfold over the next 3 centuries in a drama of ambition, brilliance, and tragedy that rivals any tale from the ancient world. The reign of Ptolemy, the second Philadelphus, began in 283 BCE with challenges that would have broken a lesser man. At 25, he inherited not just a throne, but the delicate balance his father had spent decades perfecting between Greek ambition and Egyptian tradition. The young king understood that his legitimacy depended not on the blood in his veins, but on his ability to continue the careful dance between two worlds that often seemed irreconcilable. In the pre-dawn hours of a typical morning in Alexandria, Ptolemy II would rise before the sun painted the eastern sky pink over Lake Mareotis. His private chambers, decorated with both Greek marble and Egyptian granite, reflected the dual nature of his kingdom. Egyptian servants, their movements silent as shadows, would prepare his morning meal, while Greek bodyguards took their positions outside his door. The king's day began not with royal ceremony, but with correspondence that arrived from every corner of the Mediterranean world. By the time most of his subjects began stirring, Ptolemy II was already deep in consultation with his advisors, reviewing reports from provincial governors who administered a kingdom that stretched from the first cataract of the Nile to the bustling ports of Cyrenaica. The morning briefings revealed the constant complexity of ruling a land where Greek settlers in newly founded cities lived alongside Egyptian farmers, whose families had worked the same fields since the time of the pyramids. The young king's greatest innovation lay in his understanding that prosperity required not just maintaining his father's achievements, but expanding them. Where Ptolemy I had been content to secure Egypt's borders and establish its independence, his son envisioned a kingdom that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean through trade, culture, and strategic alliances rather than conquest alone. This vision would transform Egypt from a regional power into the center of the Hellenistic world. The expansion of Alexandria's great library under Ptolemy II became the most visible symbol of this ambitious program. The king personally recruited scholars from Athens, Rhodes, and Syracuse, offering them not just generous salaries, but access to resources no other ruler could provide. In the library's expanded halls, mathematicians like Euclid developed geometric principles that students would study 2 millennia later, while geographers attempted to map the known world with unprecedented accuracy. Yet this intellectual flowering required enormous wealth to sustain, and Ptolemy II proved as innovative in generating revenue as he was in spending it. The king's administrators developed new agricultural techniques that increased crop yields throughout the Nile Valley. They introduced improved irrigation systems that brought previously barren land under cultivation, while standardizing weights and measures to facilitate trade across the kingdom's diverse regions. The daily life of ordinary Egyptians during this period reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to new opportunities. In villages throughout Upper Egypt, farmers continued to plant their fields according to the Nile's eternal rhythm. But now they might also grow new crops introduced by Greek settlers, or sell their surplus grain to merchants who shipped it to distant markets in Sicily or the Black Sea. In Memphis, the ancient capital that remained Egypt's religious heart, Egyptian priests maintained temples that had stood for thousands of years, while also participating in the new religious synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic rule. The morning rituals in the Great Temple of Ptah followed formulas carved in hieroglyphs on walls that predated Greek civilization, yet the same priests who performed these ancient ceremonies might spend their afternoons discussing philosophy with visiting scholars from the Library of Alexandria. The marketplace of Memphis during Ptolemy II's reign would have overwhelmed visitors from previous centuries with its diversity and abundance. Egyptian merchants hawked traditional goods like linen, papyrus, and gold jewelry alongside Greek pottery, Phoenician glassware, and Indian spices. The languages of commerce included not just Egyptian and Greek, but Aramaic, Hebrew, and various dialects from across the Mediterranean world. This cosmopolitan atmosphere extended to Alexandria, where the fusion of cultures created entirely new forms of art and literature. Greek poets living in the city began incorporating Egyptian themes and imagery into their work, while Egyptian artists learned to sculpt in Greek styles. The result was a cultural synthesis that was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian, but something uniquely Ptolemaic. The royal court itself embodied this cultural fusion. Ptolemy II's marriage to his sister Arsinoe II, following Egyptian pharaonic tradition, scandalized Greek public opinion, but was accepted by Egyptian subjects as natural and proper for divine rulers. The queen's influence extended far beyond ceremonial roles. She actively participated in diplomatic negotiations and administrative decisions, following precedents set by powerful Egyptian queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti. Daily court ceremonies blended Greek and Egyptian elements in ways that reinforced the dynasty's dual legitimacy. Morning audiences might begin with Greek-style presentations from foreign ambassadors, continue with Egyptian-style petitions from native officials, and conclude with religious observances that honored both Greek and Egyptian deities. These elaborate protocols required constant attention to detail, as any perceived slight to either cultural tradition could trigger political complications. The economic policies developed during Ptolemy II's reign demonstrated remarkable sophistication in managing a kingdom that encompassed diverse populations and geographic regions. The king's administrators established a royal monopoly on key industries like oil production and textile manufacturing, ensuring steady revenue streams while providing employment for thousands of workers. These state enterprises operated alongside private businesses that continued traditional crafts and trades. Agriculture remained the foundation of Egypt's prosperity, but Ptolemy II's innovations expanded agricultural production beyond anything achieved under previous rulers. Royal engineers improved the irrigation systems that channeled Nile floodwaters to distant fields, while agricultural experts experimented with new varieties of wheat and barley that could thrive in different soil conditions. The result was surplus production that fed not just Egypt's growing population, but also provided exports that generated enormous wealth. The administration of this complex economy required bureaucratic innovations that influenced governmental practices throughout the ancient world. Ptolemaic officials developed detailed record-keeping systems that tracked everything from individual tax payments to the inventory of royal warehouses. These administrative practices, recorded on thousands of papyrus documents that archaeologists continue to discover, reveal the extraordinary attention to detail that characterized Ptolemaic governance. Military affairs under Ptolemy II reflected the kingdom's strategic position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. The king maintained a navy that dominated the eastern Mediterranean, while also supporting land forces that could defend Egypt's borders against potential threats from the Seleucid Empire to the east and emerging Roman power to the west. The integration of Greek military techniques with Egyptian resources created armed forces that were both professionally competent and financially sustainable. The daily routine of Ptolemaic soldiers stationed at frontier posts like Syene, near the First Cataract, involved not just military duties, but also administrative responsibilities that reflected the kingdom's sophisticated approach to border management. These soldiers collected customs duties from Nubian traders, maintained communication networks that connected distant outposts with Alexandria, and served as the kingdom's representatives to local populations that included Egyptians, Nubians, and various nomadic tribes. Religious life throughout the kingdom during this period demonstrated the remarkable success of Ptolemaic cultural policies. In temples from the Mediterranean coast to the southern frontier, Egyptian priests performed traditional ceremonies while also participating in new religious festivals that honored both Egyptian and Greek deities. The cult of Serapis, established by Ptolemy I, reached its full flowering under his son, attracting worshippers from throughout the Mediterranean world to its magnificent temple in Alexandria. The philosophical and scientific achievements of the Alexandrian scholars during Ptolemy II's reign established intellectual traditions that would influence Western thought for centuries. Aristarchus of Samos proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, anticipating Copernican astronomy by 18 centuries. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, while Apollonius of Perga developed mathematical concepts that would later prove essential to understanding orbital mechanics. These intellectual achievements were not merely abstract exercises, but had practical applications that improved daily life throughout the kingdom. Improved understanding of astronomy led to more accurate calendars that helped farmers plan their planting and harvesting. Advances in engineering enabled the construction of better irrigation systems and more efficient machines for processing agricultural products. Medical knowledge preserved in the library's collections helped physicians throughout the Mediterranean world treat diseases more effectively. The prosperity and cultural achievement of Egypt under Ptolemy II attracted attention from rulers throughout the ancient world, but it also generated envy and suspicion that would create future challenges for the dynasty. The kingdom's wealth made it an attractive target for ambitious rivals, while its cultural innovations sometimes threatened traditional power structures in other Hellenistic kingdoms. As the sun set over Alexandria on a typical evening during the height of Ptolemy II's reign, the city's harbour would be crowded with ships from dozens of nations. Merchants from Athens discussed business deals with Egyptian traders, while scholars from the library debated philosophical questions in the city's famous gymnasia. The lighthouse guided vessels safely to port, while its light symbolized the intellectual illumination that emanated from the kingdom's capital. This was the golden age of Ptolemaic Egypt, when the careful balance between Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition created a civilization that combined the best elements of both cultures. Yet beneath this glittering surface, forces were already at work that would eventually challenge the dynasty's ability to maintain its remarkable synthesis of diverse traditions and competing interests. The Third Syrian War, that erupted in 246 BCE, would test every diplomatic skill and military strategy the Ptolemies had developed over 2 generations. When Ptolemy III Euergetes ascended the throne, he inherited not just his father's prosperous kingdom, but also a complex web of alliances and rivalries that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. The young king's sister, Berenice, had married the Seleucid ruler Antiochus II, but when her husband died under suspicious circumstances, and she was murdered along with her infant son, Ptolemy III faced a choice that would define his reign. The morning that news of his sister's death reached Alexandria, Ptolemy III stood in the palace courtyard, watching the sun rise over a city that had known peace and prosperity for decades. Egyptian gardeners tended exotic plants collected from across the known world, while Greek architects discussed plans for new monuments that would celebrate the kingdom's achievements. Yet, the king understood that this tranquil scene might soon be shattered by the drums of war. The decision to launch a massive military expedition to avenge Berenice's murder and secure her son's inheritance transformed Egypt from a primarily defensive kingdom into an aggressive imperial power. For the first time since Alexander's conquests, Egyptian armies would march beyond the traditional borders of the Nile Valley to claim territories that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. In the weeks that followed the declaration of war, Alexandria became a hive of military preparation that revealed the kingdom's remarkable organizational capabilities. Egyptian shipwrights worked alongside Greek naval architects to expand the royal fleet, while armorers produced weapons that combined traditional Egyptian craftsmanship with the latest Greek military technology. The city's warehouses overflowed with supplies destined for an expedition that would require logistical coordination on an unprecedented scale. The common soldiers who would fight in this campaign came from every corner of the kingdom. Egyptian farmers temporarily abandoned their fields to serve in infantry units that had protected the Nile Valley for generations. Greek settlers from the Delta cities joined cavalry regiments that maintained the military traditions of Macedonia. Nubian warriors brought skills in desert warfare that would prove invaluable during the long marches through Syrian territory. As Ptolemy III's armies advanced into Syria, they encountered cities that had known Greek rule for generations, but had never experienced the particular blend of Greek efficiency and Egyptian wealth that characterized Ptolemaic administration. Damascus opened its gates without resistance when the Egyptian king demonstrated that he came not as a conqueror seeking plunder, but as a liberator offering the prosperity and cultural sophistication that had made Alexandria the envy of the Mediterranean world. The daily routine of Egyptian soldiers during this campaign reflected the kingdom's approach to imperial expansion. Unlike the brutal conquest methods employed by earlier conquerors, Ptolemaic forces established administrative systems in captured territories that respected local customs while introducing the economic innovations that had generated Egypt's prosperity. Egyptian scribes worked alongside Syrian officials to establish tax systems that were both efficient and fair, while Greek engineers began construction projects that would improve local infrastructure. In Babylon, the ancient capital that had once been the seat of Alexander's empire, Ptolemy III performed ceremonies that proclaimed him the legitimate heir to the great conqueror's legacy. Egyptian priests accompanied the king to participate in rituals that honored both Mesopotamian traditions and the religious synthesis that characterized Ptolemaic rule. The sight of Egyptian pharaonic regalia in the palace where Alexander had died created a powerful symbol of cultural continuity that impressed local populations. The military successes of the Third Syrian War brought enormous wealth flowing into Egypt's royal treasury. Captured silver from Persian treasuries supplemented the gold mines of Nubia, while tribute from conquered cities provided resources that funded even more ambitious construction projects in Alexandria. The Great Library's collection expanded to include texts captured from the ancient libraries of Babylon and Seleucia, making it truly the repository of all human knowledge. Yet these triumphs came at a cost that would influence Ptolemaic policy for generations. The kingdom's military resources were stretched across territories that extended from the cataracts of the Nile to the mountains of Anatolia, requiring administrative innovations that gradually transformed Egypt's traditional governmental structures. Provincial governors who had once managed purely Egyptian territories now oversaw diverse populations that included Greeks, Syrians, Jews, Persians, and dozens of other ethnic groups. The daily correspondence that reached Ptolemy III's court during this period revealed the complexity of governing an empire that encompassed such diverse territories and populations. Reports from Egyptian administrators in the Nile Valley described traditional concerns about flood levels and crop yields, while dispatches from Syrian governors dealt with theological disputes between different Christian sects and commercial conflicts between competing merchant guilds. In Memphis, the ancient capital that remained Egypt's spiritual heart, priests maintained traditional ceremonies while also adapting their rituals to acknowledge the kingdom's expanded territorial reach. The morning offerings in the Temple of Ptah included prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies fighting in distant lands, while evening ceremonies gave thanks for victories that had brought honor to the pharaoh and prosperity to his people. The cultural impact of these military successes extended far beyond political boundaries to influence artistic and intellectual developments throughout the Ptolemaic kingdom. Greek poets in Alexandria composed epic verses celebrating the king's achievements, while Egyptian artists created sculptures and paintings that depicted the pharaoh as both a Greek hero and an Egyptian god. This artistic synthesis reflected the growing confidence of a dynasty that had successfully combined two great civilizations. The wealth generated by military conquest enabled Ptolemy III to undertake construction projects that surpassed even the achievements of his predecessors. The expansion of Alexandria's harbour included new lighthouse facilities that could guide larger numbers of ships carrying tribute and trade goods from across the expanded empire. The palace complex grew to accommodate diplomatic missions from dozens of kingdoms that now sought alliance with the most powerful ruler in the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian merchants during this golden age enjoyed trading opportunities that would have been unimaginable to their ancestors. Commercial networks that had once connected the Nile Valley with Nubia and the Levant now extended to the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the distant kingdoms of Central Asia. Egyptian linen appeared in markets from Spain to India, while exotic goods from across the known world filled Alexandria's warehouses. The administrative challenges of governing this expanded empire required innovations that influenced governmental practices throughout the ancient world. Ptolemaic officials developed communication systems that could coordinate policy across thousands of miles, while creating standardized legal codes that could be applied fairly to diverse populations with different cultural traditions and religious beliefs. Yet even as Egypt reached the height of its power and prosperity, internal tensions were developing that would eventually threaten the dynasty's stability. The costs of maintaining armies in distant territories strained even Egypt's abundant resources, while the cultural synthesis that had been the source of Ptolemaic strength became increasingly difficult to maintain as Greek and Egyptian identities evolved in different directions. The priests in Egyptian temples, while publicly supportive of their Greek rulers, privately began to question whether Pharaoh's attention to foreign conquests was diverting resources from the traditional responsibilities of Egyptian kingship. Greek settlers in Alexandria, meanwhile, sometimes resented the taxes required to fund military campaigns that brought glory to the dynasty, but seemed to offer little direct benefit to their daily lives. In the palace workshops, where royal artisans created the magnificent objects that proclaimed Ptolemaic power and sophistication, craftsmen worked with materials gathered from every corner of the known world. Indian pearls were set in gold mined in Nubia, while Syrian silver was shaped by techniques passed down through generations of Egyptian metalworkers. These luxury goods served not just as symbols of royal wealth, but as diplomatic gifts that maintained the complex alliance networks essential to imperial administration. The intellectual achievements of Alexandrian scholars during this period built upon the foundations established by earlier generations, while addressing new questions raised by the kingdom's expanded geographical and cultural horizons. Geographers attempted to map territories that Egyptian armies had reached for the first time, while historians chronicled the achievements of a dynasty that had transformed a regional kingdom into a Mediterranean empire. As winter approached in 241 BCE, Ptolemy III could survey achievements that rivaled those of Alexander himself. Egyptian control extended from the sources of the Nile to the shores of the Aegean Sea, while Alexandria had become the undisputed center of learning and culture in the ancient world. The king's morning audiences included ambassadors from Rome and Carthage, kingdoms that were beginning to recognize Egypt as a major factor in Mediterranean politics. Yet the wise king understood that military conquest was easier than imperial administration, and that the true test of his achievements would come in the peaceful decades that followed. The wealth and territory he had gained would need to be consolidated through careful diplomacy and administrative innovation if the Ptolemaic dynasty was to maintain its position as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The evening prayers in Alexandria's temples on that winter night in 241 BCE included gratitude for victories achieved and requests for wisdom to govern justly the diverse peoples who now looked to the pharaoh for protection and prosperity. The priests who offered these prayers spoke in ancient Egyptian formulas that connected the present moment to 3 millennia of pharaonic tradition, while also acknowledging the Greek innovations that had made their kingdom the wonder of the contemporary world. This was the moment when Ptolemaic Egypt reached its greatest territorial extent and cultural influence, when the careful balance between tradition and innovation that had characterized the dynasty since its founding achieved its most spectacular success. Yet even in this hour of triumph, the seeds of future challenges were already taking root in the very complexity of the empire that Ptolemy III had created. Ptolemy III had created. The prosperity that followed the Third Syrian War created an Egypt that even seasoned travelers found difficult to comprehend. In the royal quarters of Alexandria, Ptolemy III would begin each day reviewing reports that arrived by swift messenger from territories spanning 3 continents. The papyrus scrolls spread across his marble desk chronicled tax collections from Syrian cities, tribute payments from Aegean islands, and trade negotiations with kingdoms so distant their names were barely known to earlier generations of Egyptian rulers. In the harbour below the palace, ships arrived hourly carrying the wealth of empire. Phoenician vessels unloaded purple dyes and cedar wood, while Indian merchants displayed precious stones that caught the morning light like captured rainbows. The dock workers who hauled these treasures spoke a dozen different languages, yet all understood the universal tongue of commerce that made Alexandria the beating heart of Mediterranean trade. The daily life of ordinary Alexandrians during this golden age reflected opportunities their grandparents could never have imagined. Egyptian artisans found ready markets for goods that incorporated designs and techniques learned from Syrian craftsmen and Mesopotamian metalworkers. A potter might begin his morning creating traditional Egyptian vessels, spend his afternoon teaching Greek students the secrets of glazing techniques, and end his day collaborating with Phoenician merchants on designs for export markets in distant Spain. In the residential quarters where Greek settlers had established their families, households blended traditions that would have seemed incompatible to earlier generations. Children learned to read Egyptian hieroglyphs alongside Greek letters, while their mothers adapted traditional Macedonian recipes to incorporate spices brought by traders from Arabia and India. The morning meal in a prosperous Greek household might include Egyptian bread, Nubian dates, Syrian wine, and honey from the hills of Attica. Yet beneath this cosmopolitan prosperity, careful observers could detect subtle tensions that would eventually challenge the dynasty's remarkable synthesis. In the Egyptian quarters of Memphis and Thebes, priests continued their ancient rituals while privately questioning whether Pharaoh's attention to foreign territories was weakening his connection to the sacred duties that had sustained Egypt for millennia. The morning offerings in temple sanctuaries followed formulas that emphasized Pharaoh's responsibility to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that required constant attention to the Nile's floods, the people's welfare, and the god's favor. The wealth flowing from conquered territories enabled construction projects that transformed Egypt's landscape in unprecedented ways. In Alexandria, the royal architects designed new quarters that could accommodate the growing population of foreign residents while maintaining the city's distinctive character. The morning sounds that echoed through these expanding neighborhoods included the hammers of Syrian stonemasons, the chisels of Greek sculptors, and the chants of Egyptian work crews hauling massive granite blocks from distant quarries. The Great Library's expansion during this period created the ancient world's most ambitious center of learning and research. Scholars arriving from conquered territories brought with them not just their personal knowledge, but access to entire libraries that had been accumulated over centuries in cities like Babylon, Damascus, and Antioch. The morning sessions in the library's lecture halls might feature a Mesopotamian astronomer explaining Babylonian mathematical techniques to Greek students, while Egyptian physicians demonstrated surgical procedures to Syrian medical practitioners. Administrative innovation became essential as the kingdom's bureaucracy struggled to manage territories that presented unprecedented challenges. In the palace archives, scribes developed new record-keeping systems that could track tax obligations from Syrian farming villages, tribute payments from Aegean merchant cities, and military service requirements from Nubian frontier settlements. The daily correspondence that moved through these administrative networks required translation into multiple languages and adaptation to diverse legal traditions. The military forces that protected this expanded empire reflected the kingdom's remarkable diversity while maintaining the professional standards that had made Egyptian armies victorious across 3 continents. In frontier garrisons, from the Euphrates to the Nubian desert, Egyptian officers commanded units that included Greek cavalry, Syrian infantry, Nubian archers, and Arab scouts. The morning drills in these distant posts followed Macedonian military procedures while incorporating tactical innovations learned through combat experience in diverse terrains. Religious life throughout the kingdom demonstrated the continuing evolution of the cultural synthesis that had characterized Ptolemaic rule since its inception. In temples from Alexandria to Aswan, priests performed ceremonies that honored traditional Egyptian deities while acknowledging the expanded geographical reach of Pharaoh's authority. The daily rituals included prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies in distant lands and thanksgiving for victories that had brought honor to the gods and prosperity to their people. The economic policies developed during this period of maximum expansion revealed the sophisticated understanding that Ptolemaic administrators had developed regarding the management of diverse populations and resources. Royal monopolies on key industries like papyrus production and precious metal mining generated steady revenue streams while providing employment for workers throughout the kingdom. These state enterprises operated alongside private businesses that continued traditional crafts while also experimenting with new techniques learned from foreign craftsmen. Agricultural innovation remained crucial to sustaining the kingdom's expanded population and military commitments. In the Nile Valley, Egyptian farmers experimented with new irrigation techniques that could increase crop yields, while also growing exotic plants brought from conquered territories. The morning work in these experimental fields involved careful observation of soil conditions, water requirements, and seasonal patterns that might enable cultivation of Syrian grapes, Mesopotamian grains, and Anatolian fruits in Egyptian conditions. The royal court itself became a showcase of the cultural fusion that characterized Ptolemaic Egypt at its zenith. Daily ceremonies blended Egyptian pharaonic traditions with Greek royal protocols, while incorporating elements from the diverse kingdoms that now acknowledged Egyptian supremacy. Foreign ambassadors presenting tribute might participate in ancient Egyptian rituals that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority, while also engaging in Greek-style diplomatic negotiations that reflected contemporary international practices. Maritime commerce reached levels that strained even Alexandria's expanded harbour facilities. The morning arrival of merchant fleets required coordination between Egyptian port officials, Greek shipping agents, and foreign trading representatives who conducted business according to commercial laws that had evolved to accommodate the diverse legal traditions of the Mediterranean world. These bustling docks processed goods that travelled thousands of miles, while also serving as information exchanges, where news from across the known world reached Egyptian administrators within weeks of distant events. The artistic achievements of this golden age reflected the confident synthesis of traditions that had made Ptolemaic culture distinctive throughout the Mediterranean world. In royal workshops, Egyptian craftsmen worked with Syrian goldsmiths to create ceremonial objects that incorporated design elements from multiple traditions while maintaining the distinctive aesthetic that proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication. The daily activities in these workshops involved constant innovation, as artists experimented with new techniques and materials brought from conquered territories. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom adapted their curricula to prepare students for careers in an empire that spanned multiple continents and cultures. In Alexandria's schools, young Greeks learned Egyptian history and religious traditions, while Egyptian students studied Greek philosophy and military tactics. The morning lessons in these diverse classrooms created the intellectual foundations for a generation that would need to navigate the complex cultural and political landscape of Ptolemaic imperial administration. Yet even as Egypt enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and international prestige, wise observers could recognize signs of potential instability that would challenge future generations. The costs of maintaining armies in distant territories strained even Egypt's abundant resources, while the cultural diversity that had been a source of strength also created administrative complexities that required constant attention and innovation to manage effectively. The daily routines of provincial governors throughout the empire revealed the enormous challenges involved in governing territories that encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups, religious traditions, and economic systems. A typical morning in Damascus might involve mediating disputes between Syrian merchants and Egyptian tax collectors, while afternoon sessions addressed conflicts between local religious authorities and Ptolemaic cultural policies. In the palace libraries, where royal scholars compiled the administrative manuals that guided imperial governance, researchers developed new approaches to law, taxation, and cultural integration that would influence governmental practices throughout the ancient world. These detailed studies of comparative administration reflected the Ptolemaic understanding that successful empire required not just military conquest, but sophisticated institutional development that could adapt to diverse local conditions. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during the height of Ptolemy III's reign included prayers of gratitude for achievements that had elevated Egypt to unprecedented heights of power and prosperity. Yet these same prayers also requested divine guidance for the complex challenges that would face future generations as they attempted to maintain the remarkable synthesis of cultures and territories that had made the Ptolemaic kingdom the wonder of the contemporary world. The legacy that Ptolemy III would leave to his successors included not just vast territories and enormous wealth, but also the administrative innovations and cultural achievements that had transformed Egypt from a regional kingdom into the center of Mediterranean civilization. The young prince who would eventually inherit this magnificent empire would also inherit the responsibility for preserving the delicate balance of traditions and interests that had made Ptolemaic success possible, while adapting to new challenges that would test every aspect of the dynasty's remarkable achievements. As the stars appeared over Alexandria's harbor, on those glorious nights when Egyptian power reached its zenith, the lighthouse beams swept across waters crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. The light that guided these vessels safely to port also symbolized the intellectual and cultural illumination that emanated from a kingdom where Egyptian wisdom and Greek innovation had created something entirely new in human history, a civilization that honored ancient traditions while embracing the possibilities of an interconnected world, ected world. The reign of Ptolemy IV Philopator marked a turning point where the very success of his predecessors began to create challenges that no amount of wealth or cultural sophistication could easily resolve. When he ascended the throne in 221 BCE, the young king inherited an empire that stretched across 3 continents, but he also inherited the enormous costs and administrative complexities that such vast territories demanded. In the royal apartments of Alexandria, Ptolemy IV would awaken each morning to find his chambers filled with the scent of incense imported from distant Punt and the sound of Syrian musicians playing melodies that blended Egyptian rhythms with Greek harmonies. Yet beneath this luxurious facade, the daily briefings that began his day revealed mounting pressures that would test the dynasty's foundations in ways his ancestors had never experienced. The morning reports that reached the king's desk chronicled challenges that spanned from the temples of Thebes to the trading posts of the Red Sea. Egyptian priests complained that royal attention to foreign territories was neglecting the sacred duties that had sustained pharaonic rule for 3 millennia. Greek settlers in newly conquered Syrian cities demanded protection from local populations who resented foreign rule. Nubian gold mines required constant military protection against tribal raids that threatened one of the kingdom's most vital revenue sources. In Alexandria's harbour, the daily arrival of tribute ships created scenes of unprecedented abundance that masked growing financial strains. While precious goods continued to flow into Egyptian warehouses, the costs of maintaining garrisons across the Mediterranean and administering diverse populations with conflicting legal traditions consumed resources faster than even Egypt's legendary wealth could sustain. The morning activities of royal accountants involved increasingly complex calculations to balance military expenses against declining agricultural revenues caused by irregular Nile floods. The cultural fusion that had been the hallmark of Ptolemaic success began showing signs of strain as different populations within the empire developed competing visions of their relationship to Egyptian rule. In Memphis, Egyptian artisans created magnificent works that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority according to traditions that stretched back to the pyramids. Yet in Alexandria, Greek intellectuals debated philosophical questions about the nature of legitimate government that sometimes challenged the very foundations of monarchical rule. Daily life in the palace reflected these underlying tensions through subtle changes in ceremonial protocols and administrative procedures. The morning audiences that had once seamlessly blended Egyptian and Greek traditions now required careful choreography to prevent cultural misunderstandings that might escalate into political conflicts. Foreign ambassadors presenting tribute needed instruction in both Egyptian religious symbolism and Greek diplomatic customs to avoid inadvertent slights that could disrupt delicate international relationships. The Great Library continued to attract scholars from across the known world, but their research increasingly focused on practical problems of imperial administration rather than the pure intellectual pursuits that had characterized earlier generations. In the morning seminars where Egyptian priests discussed theological questions with Greek philosophers, conversations often turned to urgent matters of taxation policy, military recruitment, and legal codification that reflected the empire's growing administrative complexity. Military affairs during Ptolemy. The Fourth's reign revealed the challenges of maintaining professional forces across territories that presented vastly different strategic requirements. Egyptian soldiers stationed in Syrian frontier posts adapted their traditional tactics to address threats from nomadic raiders whose mobility and local knowledge gave them advantages that conventional military training could not easily counter. The daily routines of these distant garrisons involved not just military duties, but also diplomatic responsibilities, as soldiers served as the kingdom's primary representatives to populations that remained suspicious of foreign rule. In the Nile Valley, agricultural production continued to provide the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, but changing climate patterns and increasing demands for military supplies created pressures that strained traditional farming communities. Egyptian farmers found themselves required to grow new crops for distant markets, while also maintaining the grain production that fed the kingdom's expanding population. The morning work in these fields involved careful attention to irrigation schedules and soil conditions that had become more demanding as agricultural techniques evolved to meet imperial requirements. Religious observances throughout the kingdom during this period reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to contemporary challenges. In temples from Elephantine to Alexandria, Egyptian priests performed daily rituals that honored the gods while also praying for divine guidance in managing the complex responsibilities of imperial rule. The sacred texts recited during these ceremonies included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's obligations to maintain cosmic order, alongside newer prayers for the safety of Egyptian armies in distant lands. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets revealed the remarkable diversity of an empire that connected the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, but also demonstrated growing competition from rival trading centers that challenged Egyptian commercial dominance. The morning negotiations between Egyptian merchants and foreign traders involved increasingly complex arrangements as other kingdoms developed their own trade networks that bypassed traditional Egyptian routes. Syrian ports, Persian Gulf terminals, and Red Sea trading posts that had once depended entirely on Egyptian shipping now maintained independent commercial relationships that reduced their dependence on Ptolemaic control. The royal workshops where Egyptian craftsmen created the luxury goods that proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication faced new challenges as foreign artisans in conquered territories developed competing products that sometimes surpassed traditional Egyptian standards. In the morning sessions where master craftsmen taught their techniques to apprentices, discussions increasingly focused on innovation and adaptation, rather than the preservation of traditional methods that had sustained Egyptian artistic supremacy for generations. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom struggled to prepare students for careers in an empire where cultural diversity created both opportunities and obstacles that previous generations had never encountered. Young Egyptians learning Greek language and customs found themselves competing with native Greek speakers for positions in the royal bureaucracy, while Greek settlers, studying Egyptian traditions, discovered that local populations often preferred to deal with officials who demonstrated genuine understanding of indigenous cultures rather than superficial familiarity with foreign customs. The administrative burden of governing such a diverse empire required innovations in communication and record-keeping that pushed the limits of ancient technology. In the palace archives, scribes developed new systems for organizing correspondence that arrived in multiple languages and addressed issues ranging from tax collection in Syrian villages to diplomatic negotiations with Arabian tribal chiefs. The daily processing of this information required teams of translators and cultural interpreters who could explain not just the literal meaning of messages, but also their implications within specific local contexts. Legal affairs throughout the kingdom became increasingly complex as different populations maintained their traditional legal systems, while also acknowledging Ptolemaic royal authority. Egyptian courts in Memphis applied pharaonic law that had evolved over millennia, while Greek tribunals in Alexandria followed Macedonian legal precedents that emphasized different principles of justice and social organization. The morning sessions in these various legal institutions often addressed disputes that involved parties from multiple cultural backgrounds, requiring judges to navigate between competing legal traditions while maintaining the appearance of impartial justice. Provincial administration revealed the enormous challenges involved in maintaining effective governance across territories that encompassed deserts, mountains, river valleys, and coastal plains inhabited by populations with fundamentally different economic activities and social structures. A typical day for a Ptolemaic governor in Syria might begin with mediating conflicts between nomadic herders and settled farmers, continue with negotiations regarding tribute payments from merchant cities, and conclude with military planning sessions addressing threats from neighboring kingdoms that challenged Egyptian control. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during Ptolemy the Fourth's reign included prayers that reflected both gratitude for the empire's continued prosperity and growing concern about the sustainability of the complex system that his predecessors had created. Egyptian priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant lands now offered requests for divine wisdom in managing the internal challenges that threatened to undermine the cultural synthesis that had made Ptolemaic rule successful. Foreign policy during this period required constant attention to shifting alliances and emerging threats that reflected the changing balance of power in the Mediterranean world. Roman expansion in the Western Mediterranean created new pressures on Ptolemaic territories, while Seleucid recovery in the east threatened Egyptian control over Syrian territories that provided crucial revenue and strategic advantages. The daily diplomatic correspondence that reached Alexandria revealed an increasingly complex international situation that would require all of Egypt's resources and diplomatic skills to navigate successfully. The artistic achievements of Ptolemy the Fourth's court reflected both the continued vitality of Egyptian creative traditions and growing influences from the diverse cultures that comprised the Ptolemaic Empire. Royal commissions during this period included monuments that celebrated Egyptian pharaonic traditions alongside Greek architectural innovations, while incorporating decorative elements from Syrian, Persian, and Nubian artistic traditions that created uniquely cosmopolitan aesthetic expressions. Yet beneath these magnificent cultural achievements, careful observers could detect signs of the internal tensions that would eventually challenge the dynasty's ability to maintain its remarkable synthesis of diverse traditions and competing interests. The morning routines of palace officials revealed growing difficulties in coordinating policies across territories that presented increasingly divergent challenges, while the evening discussions among royal advisors reflected deepening concerns about the long-term sustainability of an empire that had perhaps expanded beyond the limits of effective ancient administration. The legacy that Ptolemy IV would pass to his successors included not just the territorial and cultural achievements of his predecessors, but also the unresolved tensions and emerging challenges that would test the dynasty's survival in an increasingly competitive and dangerous world. The teenager who had once walked the dusty road to Memphis with dreams of establishing a lasting dynasty had created something far more magnificent than he could have imagined, but also more fragile than his early successes had suggested possible. As the lighthouse of Alexandria swept its beam across waters that carried ships from every corner of the known world, the light illuminated both the remarkable achievements of 3 generations of Ptolemaic rule and the gathering storms that would soon test whether this extraordinary dynasty could adapt to challenges that would require even greater wisdom and innovation than their ancestors had demonstrated in creating the greatest kingdom of the ancient Mediterranean world. D. The death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BCE unleashed forces that would transform the nature of Ptolemaic rule in ways that even the dynasty's enemies could not have anticipated. As news of the king's passing spread through Alexandria's winding streets, the morning light revealed a kingdom balanced precariously between unprecedented wealth and internal contradictions that no amount of royal ceremony could disguise. In the palace chambers where the 5-year-old Ptolemy V slept under the protection of his regents, the dawn brought whispered conferences between courtiers, whose loyalty would determine not just the boy's survival, but the future of Egyptian independence itself. The child who would inherit the most powerful kingdom in the Mediterranean had been born into a world where the very success of his ancestors had created vulnerabilities that hostile neighbors were already preparing to exploit. The regency that governed Egypt during Ptolemy V's minority faced challenges that revealed the fundamental tensions within the Ptolemaic system. In the administrative halls, where Egyptian scribes had once efficiently managed correspondence from across 3 continents, morning briefings now chronicled rebellions in Upper Egypt, Syrian cities declaring independence, and Roman diplomatic missions that seemed more like reconnaissance expeditions than friendly visits. The daily routine of ordinary Egyptians during this tumultuous period reflected the growing disconnect between the cosmopolitan sophistication of Alexandria and the traditional expectations of populations throughout the Nile Valley. In villages south of Memphis, farmers who had prospered from trade with distant markets found themselves facing tax collectors who demanded payments in silver rather than grain, forcing them to deal with Greek merchants whose language and customs remained foreign despite generations of Ptolemaic rule. Egyptian priests in the great temples of Karnak and Edfu began each morning with rituals that had sustained pharaonic authority for millennia, but their afternoon discussions increasingly focused on whether their Greek rulers truly understood the sacred responsibilities that legitimized royal power in Egyptian eyes. The ancient formulas carved on temple walls spoke of Pharaoh's duty to maintain Ma'at through personal attention to the Nile's floods, the people's welfare, and the god's favor, obligations that seemed incompatible with governing an empire that stretched from Spain to India. In Alexandria's harbour, merchant ships continued to arrive with cargoes that demonstrated the remarkable reach of Ptolemaic trade networks. But the morning negotiations between Egyptian officials and foreign traders revealed growing competition from rival centres that challenged Egypt's commercial dominance. Rhodes had developed its own shipping networks that bypassed traditional Egyptian routes, while emerging Roman markets offered alternatives that reduced foreign dependence on Ptolemaic ports and services. The Great Library's scholars maintained their research into mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, but their morning seminars increasingly addressed practical questions about military engineering and administrative efficiency that reflected the kingdom's growing security concerns. The intellectual pursuits that had once been pursued for their own sake now served urgent political purposes as scholars developed new catapult designs, improved siege techniques, and communication systems that could coordinate defences across vast territories. Military preparations throughout the kingdom revealed the enormous challenges of defending an empire whose expansion had perhaps exceeded the limits of ancient logistics and communication. Egyptian officers stationed in Syrian garrisons began their days reviewing intelligence reports about Seleucid military movements, while also managing local populations whose loyalty could no longer be taken for granted. The morning drills that had once focused on standard battlefield tactics now emphasized siege defense and urban warfare as Egyptian forces prepared for conflicts that might determine the survival of Ptolemaic rule. In Memphis, the ancient capital that remained Egypt's spiritual heart, the morning offerings in the Temple of Ptah included prayers for the young pharaoh's protection and wisdom, but also requests for divine intervention to preserve the cosmic order that foreign influences seemed to threaten. The priests who performed these ceremonies spoke in ancient Egyptian formulas while also conducting business with Greek administrators whose decisions affected temple revenues and religious practices throughout the kingdom. Agricultural production in the Nile Valley continued to provide the foundation of Egyptian prosperity. But changing political circumstances created new pressures that strained traditional farming communities. Increased military recruitment removed young men from agricultural work, just as higher taxation demands required farmers to increase their productivity. The morning labour in fields from Aswan to the Delta involved careful calculation of irrigation schedules and crop rotations that had become more complex as farmers struggled to meet both subsistence needs and tribute obligations. Provincial administration throughout the empire faced mounting difficulties as local populations increasingly questioned the benefits of Egyptian rule, while neighbouring kingdoms offered attractive alternatives to Ptolemaic control. A typical morning in Damascus might involve negotiations with Syrian merchants, who threatened to redirect their trade through Seleucid territories, while afternoon sessions addressed complaints from local officials, who found their authority undermined by competing loyalties among their subordinates. The royal court's daily ceremonies attempted to maintain the appearance of stability and continuity, but careful observers could detect subtle changes that reflected the underlying tensions threatening Ptolemaic authority. Foreign ambassadors, who had once competed for audiences with Egyptian officials, now arrived with proposals that seemed more like ultimatums than diplomatic initiatives. The elaborate protocols that had once demonstrated Egyptian sophistication now required constant adjustment to address shifting political realities. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets reflected both the continued vitality of Egyptian trade and growing concerns about the kingdom's long-term economic prospects. Syrian merchants who had once depended entirely on Egyptian shipping networks began establishing independent arrangements with Roman and Rhodian traders. The morning negotiations in Alexandria's commercial district involved increasingly complex discussions about credit terms, insurance arrangements, and alternative transportation routes that reduced foreign dependence on Ptolemaic infrastructure. Religious observances throughout the kingdom during this period of uncertainty revealed the deep cultural divisions that had been masked by decades of prosperity and military success. Egyptian temples maintained traditional ceremonies that emphasized Pharaoh's divine authority according to ancient traditions, while Greek shrines in Alexandria conducted rituals that reflected Hellenistic concepts of kingship that sometimes conflicted with Egyptian religious expectations. Educational institutions struggled to prepare students for careers in a kingdom where traditional certainties about Egyptian power and cultural superiority were increasingly questioned by contemporary realities. Young Egyptians, learning Greek customs, discovered that mastery of foreign languages and traditions did not guarantee advancement in a bureaucracy where political loyalty had become more important than administrative competence. Greek settlers studying Egyptian traditions found themselves caught between conflicting cultural expectations as local populations demanded greater respect for indigenous customs. Legal affairs throughout the kingdom became increasingly contentious as different populations invoked competing legal traditions to challenge Ptolemaic policies and administrative decisions. Egyptian courts applying traditional pharaonic law found themselves addressing disputes that involved Roman citizens claiming special privileges, while Greek tribunals struggled to resolve conflicts that required understanding of local customs they had never been required to master. The artistic production of royal workshops during this period reflected both continued technical excellence and growing uncertainty about the cultural identity that Ptolemaic art was supposed to represent. Egyptian craftsmen creating ceremonial objects for royal occasions incorporated design elements from multiple traditions while struggling to maintain the distinctive aesthetic that had proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication throughout the Mediterranean world. Foreign policy challenges multiplied as the kingdom's enemies recognized opportunities to exploit Egyptian internal divisions while advancing their own territorial ambitions. Roman expansion in the eastern Mediterranean created direct pressure on Ptolemaic territories, while Seleucid recovery under Antiochus III threatened Egyptian control over Syrian cities that provided crucial revenue and strategic advantages. The daily diplomatic correspondence reaching Alexandria revealed an international situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous for a kingdom whose military resources were already stretched beyond sustainable limits. Economic policies developed during this period reflected desperate attempts to maintain imperial revenues, while addressing growing resistance from populations that questioned the benefits of continued Egyptian rule. Royal monopolies on key industries faced competition from alternative suppliers in territories beyond Ptolemaic control, while traditional taxation systems encountered increasing evasion as local populations developed economic relationships that bypassed Egyptian administrative oversight. The morning routines of palace officials revealed growing coordination difficulties as administrators struggled to implement policies across territories that presented increasingly divergent challenges and opportunities. Syrian governors dealt with populations that had attractive alternatives to Egyptian rule, while Nubian commanders faced tribal coalitions that threatened crucial gold mining operations. Egyptian administrators in the Delta confronted economic disruptions caused by competition from rival trading centers. Military recruitment throughout the kingdom encountered resistance that reflected changing popular attitudes towards service in Egyptian armies. Traditional sources of Egyptian soldiers in farming communities faced economic pressures that made military service less attractive, while Greek settlers in conquered territories sometimes preferred to negotiate directly with local rulers rather than depend on distant Egyptian protection. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during this period of mounting crisis included prayers that reflected both continued loyalty to the Ptolemaic dynasty and growing concern about the kingdom's ability to maintain the cultural synthesis and territorial control that had made Egyptian rule successful for 3 centuries. Priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant lands now offered requests for divine intervention to preserve the cosmic order that foreign pressures seemed to threaten. Administrative innovations developed during these challenging years reflected sophisticated understanding of the problems facing Ptolemaic rule, but also revealed the limitations of ancient governmental systems when confronted with the complexities of managing diverse populations across vast territories. New communication procedures attempted to coordinate policy implementation while accounting for local variations. But these systems required resources and personnel that the kingdom could no longer easily provide. Cultural developments during Ptolemy V's minority reflected both the continued vitality of Egyptian creative traditions and growing influences from external sources that sometimes challenged traditional Ptolemaic aesthetic principles. Royal commissions included monuments that celebrated Egyptian pharaonic traditions, while incorporating architectural and decorative elements from Roman, Syrian, and other foreign sources that reflected the kingdom's changing political relationships. Yet beneath these adaptations and innovations, fundamental questions about the sustainability of Ptolemaic rule remained unresolved. The morning deliberations of royal advisors increasingly addressed scenarios that previous generations had never needed to consider: the possibility of territorial losses, the challenges of governing a reduced kingdom, and the diplomatic strategies required to maintain Egyptian independence in a world where Roman power was becoming the dominant factor in Mediterranean politics. The teenage regents who guided policy during these crucial years understood that their decisions would determine whether the remarkable civilization created by 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule would survive the emerging challenges or fragment under pressures that had already destroyed other Hellenistic kingdoms. The administrative systems, cultural achievements, and economic innovations that had made Egypt the wonder of the ancient world now faced tests that would reveal whether the dynasty's synthesis of Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition could adapt to a transformed political landscape. As Alexandria's lighthouse continued to guide ships from across the known world into the kingdom's principal harbour, the beam that had once symbolized Egyptian cultural and political leadership now illuminated waters where Roman vessels appeared with increasing frequency. The light that swept across the Mediterranean each night served as a reminder of both the remarkable achievements of Ptolemaic civilization and the uncertain future that awaited a dynasty whose success had created vulnerabilities that its founders could never have anticipated. The young pharaoh sleeping in the palace chambers would awaken to inherit not just the wealth and territories that his ancestors had accumulated, but also the responsibility for preserving a kingdom whose survival would require wisdom and innovation that surpassed even the remarkable achievements of the dynasty's golden age. The morning sun that would rise over Alexandria in the years to come would illuminate a kingdom fighting for its very existence against forces that threatened to destroy everything that 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule had created and preserved. Wealth and territories just the preserved ancestors had accumulated survived require that hist innovation that, but also the responsibility kingdom whose past even the remarkable would achievements of this golden for suring a wisdom and to come would illuminate a dynasty'd rise over Alexandria, its very age. The morning sun forces that threatened that were. The years, centuries of Ptolemaic rule for existence against in kingdom fighting that threed to destroy everything preserved, created and the coronation of Ptolemy III, Epiphanes, in 196 BCE marked not a celebration of royal power, but a desperate attempt to restore legitimacy to a dynasty that had begun to fracture under pressures no amount of ceremony could truly address. The Rosetta Stone, carved to commemorate this event in 3 languages, would become more famous for what it revealed to modern scholars than for its original purpose of proclaiming pharaonic authority to subjects who increasingly questioned their ruler's divine mandate. In the pre-dawn darkness of Memphis, Egyptian priests prepared for ceremonies that would blend 3 millennia of pharaonic tradition with Greek royal customs that still felt foreign after 2 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The young king, now 12 years old, would participate in rituals his ancestors had designed to demonstrate the seamless fusion of 2 great civilizations. Yet the very need for such elaborate demonstrations revealed how tenuous that fusion had become. The morning preparations in the Temple of Ptah required careful coordination between Egyptian priests who maintained ancient traditions and Greek advisors who sought to adapt those traditions to contemporary political necessities. Hieroglyphic texts carved on temple walls proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority in formulas that stretched back to the Old Kingdom, while Greek translations attempted to convey concepts that had no equivalent in Hellenistic political thought. The incense that filled the sacred chambers carried prayers in Egyptian that requested divine protection for a pharaoh whose Greek advisors understood power in entirely different terms. As the sun rose over the ancient capital, crowds gathered in Memphis's streets to witness ceremonies that would determine whether the Ptolemaic synthesis could survive the centrifugal forces threatening to tear the kingdom apart. Egyptian farmers who had travelled from villages throughout the Nile Valley mixed with Greek settlers from delta cities, creating an audience that embodied both the diversity and the divisions that characterized late Ptolemaic society. Children whose grandparents had prospered under earlier Ptolemaic rulers now faced an uncertain future, as traditional sources of stability seemed increasingly fragile. The coronation rituals themselves revealed the careful balance that Ptolemaic ceremonies had always required, but also the growing difficulty of maintaining that balance under contemporary pressures. Egyptian priests anointed the young pharaoh with sacred oils while reciting ancient formulas that proclaimed his divine nature. Yet Greek observers understood these same ceremonies as political theatre, designed to legitimize a dynasty whose power increasingly depended on foreign support rather than indigenous acceptance. In Alexandria, the morning brought news from across the Mediterranean that demonstrated how dramatically the kingdom's strategic position had deteriorated since the golden age of Ptolemy III. Roman legions were consolidating control over western Mediterranean territories, while Seleucid armies threatened Egyptian positions in Syria. The correspondence that reached royal advisors chronicled setbacks that would have been unthinkable during the dynasty's earlier period of expansion and confident cultural synthesis. The daily administration of what remained of the Ptolemaic Empire required constant adaptation to circumstances that changed faster than traditional governmental systems could accommodate. Provincial governors who had once managed prosperous territories now dealt with populations that had attractive alternatives to Egyptian rule, while military commanders struggled to defend frontiers with forces that were increasingly composed of foreign mercenaries rather than loyal Egyptian or Greek troops. Egyptian merchants in Alexandria's markets faced competition that threatened commercial networks their families had maintained for generations. The morning negotiations that had once focused on expanding trade relationships now involved desperate attempts to preserve existing connections as rival powers offered alternative arrangements to foreign partners who had traditionally depended on Egyptian shipping and financial services. Syrian traders who had once competed for access to Egyptian markets now possessed their own networks that bypassed traditional Ptolemaic commercial routes. In the royal workshops, where Egyptian craftsmen had created luxury goods that proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication throughout the Mediterranean world, artisans adapted their techniques to address changing market conditions and political realities. The morning activities in these workshops involved creating objects that maintained traditional standards of excellence, while acknowledging that the international audience for Egyptian artistic production had shifted in ways that required new approaches to design and marketing. Agricultural production in the Nile Valley continued to provide the foundation of Egyptian prosperity, but farmers faced pressures that reflected the kingdom's deteriorating political position. Increased taxation to fund military expenses coincided with reduced protection for agricultural communities as Egyptian forces were withdrawn to defend more strategically critical territories. The morning work in fields from Aswan to the Delta involved calculations that balanced traditional farming practices with new requirements imposed by administrators who understood that agricultural surplus was essential for the kingdom's survival. The Great Library scholars maintained their research activities, but their morning seminars increasingly addressed practical questions about military technology, diplomatic strategy, and economic policy rather than the pure intellectual pursuits that had characterized earlier generations. Mathematicians developed new approaches to calculating siege trajectories, while geographers created maps that emphasized defensive positions rather than trade routes. The intellectual traditions that had made Alexandria famous throughout the ancient world now served urgent political purposes as scholars worked to preserve a civilization under siege. Religious observances throughout the kingdom reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to contemporary uncertainties. In temples from Elephantine to Tanis, Egyptian priests performed daily rituals that honored the gods, while also praying for divine intervention to preserve the cosmic order that foreign pressures threatened to disrupt. The morning ceremonies included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's sacred responsibilities, alongside newer prayers for the safety of Egyptian territories and the preservation of traditional ways of life. Military recruitment throughout the remaining Ptolemaic territories encountered difficulties that revealed changing popular attitudes towards service in Egyptian armies. Traditional sources of loyal soldiers in farming communities faced economic pressures that made military service less attractive, while Greek settlers in frontier regions sometimes preferred to negotiate directly with local rulers rather than depend on distant Egyptian protection that seemed increasingly unreliable. Provincial administration in territories that remained under Ptolemaic control required innovations that addressed the reality of reduced resources and increased external pressure. Governors who had once managed expansion now focused on consolidation, while administrators developed new approaches to taxation and legal procedures that could maintain essential governmental functions with limited personnel and financial resources. The morning briefings that reached these officials chronicled challenges that required immediate attention, while also planning for scenarios that previous generations had never needed to consider. The royal court's daily ceremonies attempted to maintain traditions that had once demonstrated Egyptian power and cultural sophistication, but these elaborate protocols now served primarily to reassure domestic audiences rather than to impress foreign visitors who increasingly viewed Egyptian traditions as relics of a declining civilization. Foreign ambassadors who attended court functions often represented powers that were negotiating with Egypt from positions of strength rather than seeking Egyptian patronage or protection. Legal affairs throughout the kingdom became increasingly complex as different populations invoked competing legal traditions to challenge Ptolemaic policies while also seeking protection from external threats that traditional Egyptian law had never been designed to address. Egyptian courts applying pharaonic legal principles found themselves dealing with commercial disputes involving Roman citizens and military conflicts that required understanding of international law that had evolved beyond traditional Egyptian jurisprudence. Commercial activity in Alexandria's harbour continued to demonstrate the city's strategic importance, but the morning activities of merchants and traders revealed fundamental changes in the patterns that had sustained Egyptian prosperity for centuries. Ships arriving from distant ports carried not just goods for Egyptian markets, but also intelligence about political developments that could affect the kingdom's survival and diplomatic communications that reflected Egypt's declining influence in international affairs. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom struggled to prepare students for careers in a world where traditional assumptions about Egyptian power and cultural superiority no longer applied. Young Egyptians learning administrative skills discovered that their training needed to address scenarios their teachers had never encountered, while Greek settlers studying Egyptian traditions found themselves preserving cultural knowledge that might be lost if current political trends continued. The artistic production of royal workshops during this period reflected both technical excellence and cultural uncertainty as craftsmen created objects that maintained traditional standards while addressing contemporary political and economic realities. Egyptian artists working on royal commissions incorporated design elements that appealed to foreign patrons who now possessed alternatives to Egyptian artistic production, while also preserving traditional techniques that embodied cultural values threatened by external pressures. Foreign policy during Ptolemy V's reign required constant attention to shifting alliances and emerging threats that reflected the transformed balance of power in the Mediterranean world. Roman expansion created direct pressure on remaining Ptolemaic territories, while Seleucid recovery under Antiochus III threatened Egyptian control over strategically vital positions. The daily diplomatic correspondence that reached Alexandria revealed an international situation where Egyptian options were increasingly limited by factors beyond the kingdom's control. Economic policies developed during this period reflected attempts to maintain essential governmental functions while acknowledging reduced resources and increased external pressure. Royal monopolies on traditional industries faced competition from alternative suppliers in territories beyond Ptolemaic control, while taxation systems required modification to address changing economic conditions that had reduced the kingdom's traditional revenue sources. The morning routines of palace officials revealed coordination difficulties that reflected the challenges of governing a reduced kingdom while maintaining the administrative structures designed for a much larger empire. Syrian territories that had provided crucial revenue were now beyond Egyptian control, while African provinces required increased military protection against threats that strained available resources. Egyptian administrators struggled to implement policies that addressed immediate needs, while also planning for long-term survival in a transformed political landscape. Military affairs during this period required strategic thinking that departed dramatically from the expansion-focused approaches that had characterized earlier Ptolemaic policy. Egyptian commanders developed defensive strategies that maximized the advantages provided by the kingdom's geographic position, while acknowledging limitations imposed by reduced manpower and financial resources. The morning drills in remaining Egyptian garrisons emphasized tactics suitable for defending fixed positions, rather than the mobile operations that had once carried Egyptian armies across 3 continents. Cultural developments during Ptolemy V's reign reflected both the continued vitality of Egyptian creative traditions and growing external influences that sometimes challenged traditional Ptolemaic aesthetic principles. Royal commissions included monuments that celebrated Egyptian achievements, while also acknowledging the political realities that required diplomatic accommodation with foreign powers whose cultural preferences differed significantly from traditional Egyptian values. Administrative innovations developed during these challenging years demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the problems facing Ptolemaic rule, but also revealed the limitations of ancient governmental systems when confronted with rapid political and economic changes. New procedures for tax collection attempted to maintain revenue levels while avoiding popular resistance, while communication systems tried to coordinate policy implementation across territories that faced different types of external pressure. Religious developments throughout the kingdom during this period reflected both loyalty to traditional beliefs and adaptation to circumstances that tested the theological foundations of pharaonic authority. Egyptian priests maintained ancient ceremonies while also developing new interpretations of traditional teachings that could address contemporary challenges. The morning prayers in temples throughout the Nile Valley included requests for divine guidance in preserving traditions that foreign influences seemed to threaten. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during Ptolemy V's reign included prayers that reflected both continued devotion to the Ptolemaic dynasty and growing concern about the kingdom's ability to maintain the cultural synthesis and territorial integrity that had made Egyptian rule successful for 3 centuries. Priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant lands now offered requests for divine intervention to preserve the cosmic order that external pressures threatened to disrupt. Yet beneath these adaptations and innovations, fundamental questions about the future of Ptolemaic civilization remained unresolved. The young pharaoh, who participated in traditional ceremonies, understood that his reign would determine whether the remarkable achievements of his ancestors could survive in a world where the conditions that had made Ptolemaic success possible no longer existed. The administrative systems, cultural traditions, and economic foundations that had sustained the dynasty for 3 centuries now faced challenges that would test their adaptability beyond anything previous generations had experienced. As night fell over Alexandria, the lighthouse beam that swept across the harbour illuminated waters where Roman ships appeared with increasing frequency, serving as a reminder that the political landscape of the Mediterranean had changed in ways that would require unprecedented wisdom and innovation for the Ptolemaic dynasty to survive. The young kings sleeping in palace chambers would awaken each morning to face decisions that would determine whether the synthesis of Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition that had created one of history's greatest civilizations could adapt to challenges that threatened its very existence. The young Ptolemy V's daily routine in the palace revealed the precarious balance between maintaining royal dignity and acknowledging the harsh realities that surrounded his diminished kingdom. Each morning, as servants lit the oil lamps in his private chambers, the teenage pharaoh would find scrolls waiting on his desk that chronicled territorial losses, diplomatic setbacks, and financial shortfalls that would have been unimaginable during his great-grandfather's reign. The palace itself reflected these changing circumstances in subtle but unmistakable ways. Rooms that had once overflowed with tribute from distant provinces now stood partially empty, their marble floors echoing with the footsteps of a reduced court staff. Egyptian craftsmen who had once worked exclusively on luxury items for international gift exchange now spent their mornings repairing existing furnishings rather than creating new masterpieces that proclaimed royal wealth to foreign dignitaries. In the administrative quarters where royal scribes managed what remained of the empire's correspondence, the daily briefings painted an increasingly grim picture of Egypt's strategic position. Syrian cities that had once competed for Egyptian favor now sent ambassadors who politely explained their new arrangements with Seleucid rulers. Nubian chieftains, who had traditionally delivered gold as tribute, began requesting Egyptian military assistance against tribal coalitions that threatened the very mines that had enriched Pharaoh's treasury for generations. The morning walk through Alexandria's palace gardens, that had once been a peaceful respite for royal contemplation, now served as an opportunity for urgent consultations with advisors who brought news that required immediate decisions. Greek generals reported difficulties recruiting soldiers from communities that had lost confidence in Egyptian military capabilities, while Egyptian priests delivered warnings about growing unrest in Upper Egypt, where traditional populations questioned whether their Greek rulers truly understood the sacred obligations that legitimized pharaonic authority. Daily life for ordinary Alexandrians during this period reflected the broader uncertainties that characterized late Ptolemaic society. Merchants who had built their prosperity on trade networks spanning 3 continents found themselves competing with rivals who offered more reliable shipping arrangements and better access to emerging markets. The morning activities in the city's commercial districts involved increasingly desperate negotiations as established businesses struggled to maintain relationships that had sustained their families for generations. In the harbour, ships continued to arrive from across the Mediterranean, but their cargoes revealed the changing nature of Alexandria's role in international commerce. Where previous generations had seen vessels carrying tribute and luxury goods destined for royal warehouses, observers now witnessed merchant ships conducting business that bypassed traditional Egyptian intermediaries entirely. Syrian traders negotiated directly with Roman merchants, while Nubian gold reached Greek markets through routes that avoided Egyptian taxation and administrative oversight. The Great Library maintained its reputation as a center of learning, but the scholars who gathered in its halls now focused their research on practical questions that reflected the kingdom's deteriorating circumstances. Morning seminars that had once explored abstract mathematical concepts now addressed urgent problems of military engineering and defensive architecture. Geographers who had previously mapped distant territories for potential conquest now concentrated on identifying defensible positions within Egypt's shrinking borders. Egyptian priests throughout the kingdom began each day with rituals that had sustained pharaonic authority for millennia, but their afternoon discussions increasingly addressed theological questions about divine favor and royal legitimacy that had rarely troubled earlier generations. In temples from Edfu to Denda, religious authorities maintained ancient ceremonies, while privately questioning whether the cosmic order that justified pharaonic rule could survive the political chaos that seemed to engulf the Mediterranean world. Agricultural communities in the Nile Valley faced pressures that tested traditional relationships between farmers and royal administrators. Increased taxation demands coincided with reduced military protection, as Egyptian forces were concentrated around strategic positions rather than distributed throughout rural territories. The morning work in fields that had prospered under earlier Ptolemaic policies now involved careful calculations about crop selection and marketing arrangements that could minimize exposure to political instability. Provincial governors who remained loyal to Ptolemaic authority struggled with administrative challenges that required constant innovation and adaptation. A typical day in Thebes might begin with reports about bandits threatening trade routes, continue with negotiations regarding tribute payments from communities that questioned Egyptian military capabilities, and conclude with diplomatic correspondence addressing territorial disputes that reflected the kingdom's weakened international position. Military preparations throughout the remaining Egyptian territories revealed the fundamental transformation that had occurred in the kingdom's strategic circumstances. Officers who had once planned expansion campaigns now focused on defensive strategies that could maximize the advantages provided by Egypt's geographic position, while acknowledging severe limitations in manpower and financial resources. Training exercises that had emphasized mobile operations designed for conquest now concentrated on siege defense and urban warfare tactics suitable for protecting fixed positions. The royal court's elaborate ceremonial protocols continued to follow traditions established during the dynasty's golden age. But these magnificent displays now served primarily to maintain domestic morale, rather than to impress foreign visitors with Egyptian power and sophistication. Ambassadors who attended court functions often represented kingdoms that were negotiating with Egypt from positions of strength rather than seeking Egyptian patronage or military alliance. Legal proceedings throughout the kingdom reflected the complex jurisdictional questions that arose when traditional Egyptian law encountered Roman legal concepts and Seleucid administrative practices. Egyptian courts, applying pharaonic legal principles, found themselves addressing commercial disputes that involved foreign merchants claiming special privileges, while Greek tribunals struggled with cases that required understanding of local customs they had never been required to master during the dynasty's period of unchallenged dominance. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets revealed both the continued importance of Egyptian agricultural production and the growing competition from alternative suppliers who could offer foreign buyers more favorable terms and more reliable delivery arrangements. The morning negotiations between Egyptian merchants and international traders involved increasingly complex discussions about credit arrangements, transportation insurance, and alternative shipping routes that reflected the kingdom's declining influence over Mediterranean commerce. Educational institutions throughout Egypt struggled to prepare students for careers in a political environment that bore little resemblance to the circumstances that had shaped traditional curricula. Young Egyptians studying administrative procedures discovered that their training needed to address scenarios involving foreign occupation and cultural survival that their teachers had never contemplated. Greek settlers, learning Egyptian customs, found themselves preserving traditions that might disappear entirely if current political trends continued unchecked. Religious observances in temples throughout the kingdom included prayers that reflected both traditional devotion to pharaonic authority and growing anxiety about divine protection for a dynasty that seemed increasingly vulnerable to external threats. The morning ceremonies in the Great Temple of Karnak included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's sacred responsibilities, alongside newer supplications for divine intervention to preserve the cosmic order that foreign pressures threatened to destroy. Artistic production in royal workshops during this period demonstrated both technical excellence and cultural uncertainty as craftsmen created objects that maintained traditional standards while addressing political realities that required diplomatic sensitivity. Egyptian artists working on royal commissions incorporated design elements that would appeal to foreign patrons whose favor had become essential for the kingdom's survival, while also preserving traditional techniques that embodied cultural values threatened by external political pressure. Foreign policy during the final decades of meaningful Ptolemaic independence required diplomatic skills that surpassed anything previous generations had needed to develop. Egyptian negotiators found themselves managing relationships with Roman officials, who viewed Egypt primarily as a source of grain and revenue, while also maintaining connections with other Hellenistic kingdoms that faced similar pressures from expanding Roman power. Economic policies implemented during Ptolemy the Fifth's reign reflected desperate attempts to maintain governmental functions, while acknowledging that traditional revenue sources had either been lost to foreign conquest or compromised by competition from rival powers. Royal monopolies on industries like papyrus production and perfume manufacturing faced challenges from alternative suppliers who could offer foreign customers better prices and more reliable service. The daily correspondence that reached palace administrators revealed coordination difficulties that reflected the challenges of governing a kingdom whose territorial integrity was constantly threatened by external pressure and internal dissent. Communications from Upper Egypt described growing unrest among traditional populations who questioned whether their Greek rulers possessed the divine authority necessary to maintain cosmic order, while reports from the Delta chronicled economic disruptions caused by Roman interference in Egyptian commercial relationships. Military recruitment throughout the kingdom encountered resistance that reflected changing popular attitudes towards service in armies that seemed increasingly unlikely to achieve victory against foreign enemies. Traditional sources of loyal Egyptian soldiers in farming communities faced economic hardships that made military service less attractive, while Greek settler families sometimes preferred to negotiate independent arrangements with foreign powers rather than depend on Egyptian protection that appeared increasingly unreliable. Cultural developments during this period reflected both the continued creativity of Egyptian artistic traditions and growing external influences that challenged traditional aesthetic principles. Royal commissions included monuments that celebrated pharaonic achievements, while also acknowledging political realities that required accommodation with foreign powers, whose cultural preferences differed from traditional Egyptian values. Administrative innovations developed during these challenging years demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the governmental problems facing late Ptolemaic rule, but also revealed the limitations of ancient bureaucratic systems when confronted with rapid political change and external military pressure. New procedures for tax collection attempted to maintain essential revenue levels while avoiding popular resistance that could provide opportunities for foreign intervention. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during this period included prayers that reflected both loyalty to Ptolemaic traditions and growing concern about the dynasty's ability to preserve the cultural synthesis that had made Egyptian civilization distinctive throughout the Mediterranean world. Priests, who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant territories, now offered supplications for divine guidance in preserving traditions that seemed increasingly fragile under external pressure. Yet, even as the political foundations of Ptolemaic rule crumbled under pressures that no amount of ceremonial magnificence could address, the cultural achievements of 3 centuries continued to influence intellectual and artistic development throughout the ancient world. The mathematical principles developed by Alexandrian scholars would guide scientific progress for generations, while the architectural innovations pioneered in Ptolemaic temples would inspire builders across 3 continents long after the dynasty itself had fallen. The young pharaoh, who walked through Alexandria's palace corridors, understood that his decisions would determine not just his personal survival, but whether the remarkable synthesis of Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition could adapt to challenges that threatened to destroy everything his ancestors had created. The morning sun that rose over the harbour each day illuminated a kingdom fighting for its cultural identity as much as its political independence, as the forces of history moved inexorably toward the climactic confrontation that would determine the fate of the last independent pharaonic dynasty, and the final chapter in 3 millennia of Egyptian greatness. The final century of Ptolemaic rule would witness transformations that even the most prescient advisors could never have anticipated, as the kingdom that had once dominated the Mediterranean found itself navigating an increasingly treacherous world where survival required abandoning many of the principles that had made the dynasty great. The accession of Ptolemy VI Philometor in 180 BCE brought to the throne a child whose reign would be shaped by forces beyond any pharaoh's control. In the pre-dawn hours of his palace chambers, young servants would prepare the morning meal, while Greek tutors waited outside with lessons that increasingly focused on diplomatic survival rather than imperial conquest. The boy king's education included not just traditional studies of Egyptian religion and Greek philosophy, but practical instruction in negotiating with Roman senators, whose favour had become essential for the dynasty's continuation. The daily routine in Alexandria's administrative quarters revealed the stark reality of Egypt's transformed circumstances. Where previous generations of royal scribes had managed correspondence from across 3 continents, officials now spent their mornings crafting carefully worded responses to Roman demands that tested the limits of Egyptian sovereignty. The papyrus scrolls that covered their desks chronicled grain shipments to Rome, tribute payments to foreign creditors, and territorial concessions that would have been unthinkable during the dynasty's golden age. In the harbour below the palace, merchant ships arrived with cargoes that demonstrated Egypt's continuing economic importance, while also revealing the kingdom's growing dependence on foreign goodwill. Roman vessels unloaded luxury goods and manufactured products that Egyptian artisans could no longer produce competitively, while loading grain and papyrus that represented the kingdom's most reliable sources of revenue. The morning negotiations between Egyptian port officials and Roman merchants involved delicate discussions about pricing, transportation schedules, and commercial privileges that reflected the unequal nature of contemporary political relationships. The great library's scholars maintained their research activities, but their work now served purposes that extended far beyond pure intellectual inquiry. Morning seminars addressed questions about Roman law, Latin literature, and Greek diplomatic traditions that would be essential for navigating the complex political environment that surrounded Egyptian independence. Mathematicians developed new approaches to calculating tribute payments and tax assessments, while geographers created maps that emphasized Egypt's strategic value to potential protectors, rather than its historical achievements as a conquering power. Egyptian priests throughout the kingdom began each day with rituals that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority, according to traditions that stretched back 3 millennia. Yet their afternoon discussions increasingly addressed theological questions about legitimate rule and foreign influence that had rarely troubled earlier generations. In temples from Aswan to Alexandria, religious authorities maintained ancient ceremonies while privately debating whether the cosmic order could survive the political compromises that seemed necessary for the dynasty's survival. Agricultural communities in the Nile Valley continued their eternal rhythm of planting and harvesting, but farmers now worked under circumstances that reflected Egypt's diminished autonomy. Roman demands for increased grain exports coincided with reduced governmental protection for rural communities as Egyptian military forces were concentrated around strategic positions that could be defended against potential invaders. The morning labor in fields that had prospered under earlier Ptolemaic policies now involved careful attention to crop varieties and cultivation techniques that could maximize yields for export markets rather than domestic consumption. The royal court's magnificent ceremonial displays continued to follow protocols established during the dynasty's period of expansion and cultural confidence. But these elaborate rituals now served primarily to maintain domestic legitimacy rather than to impress foreign visitors with Egyptian power. Roman officials who attended court functions often participated as representatives of a superior power rather than as diplomatic equals seeking Egyptian alliance or favor. Daily life for ordinary Alexandrians during this period reflected the profound changes that had transformed their city from the undisputed center of Mediterranean culture into a provincial capital whose independence depended on foreign tolerance rather than indigenous strength. Merchants who had inherited business networks spanning multiple continents found themselves competing with Roman traders who possessed better access to credit and more reliable transportation arrangements. The morning activities in commercial districts involved increasingly complex negotiations as established families struggled to maintain relationships that had sustained their prosperity for generations. In the palace workshops, where Egyptian craftsmen had created luxury goods that proclaimed Ptolemaic sophistication, throughout the ancient world, artisans adapted their techniques to address market demands that reflected changing political circumstances. The morning sessions in these workshops involved creating objects that maintained traditional standards of excellence while incorporating design elements that would appeal to Roman customers whose preferences were beginning to influence artistic production throughout the Mediterranean. Provincial administration in territories that remained under direct Egyptian control required constant adaptation to circumstances that changed faster than traditional governmental systems could accommodate. Governors who had once managed expansion now focused on maintaining order while avoiding conflicts that might provide pretexts for foreign intervention. The morning briefings that reached these officials chronicled challenges that required immediate attention, while also planning for scenarios that involved potential loss of autonomy or territorial integrity. Military affairs during Ptolemy, the sixth's reign, reflected the fundamental transformation that had occurred in Egypt's strategic position. Officers who had trained for conquest campaigns now developed defensive strategies that could protect the kingdom's core territories, while avoiding provocations that might trigger overwhelming retaliation from superior enemies. Training exercises emphasized garrison duties and civil order maintenance, rather than the mobile operations that had once carried Egyptian armies across 3 continents. Legal proceedings throughout the kingdom reflected the complex jurisdictional questions that arose when traditional Egyptian law encountered Roman legal concepts and administrative practices. Egyptian courts, applying pharaonic principles, found themselves addressing commercial disputes that involved Roman citizens claiming special privileges based on treaties and agreements that superseded traditional legal procedures. Greek tribunals struggled with cases that required understanding of Roman law while also respecting local customs that had evolved over centuries of Ptolemaic rule. Religious observances in temples throughout Egypt included prayers that reflected both traditional devotion to pharaonic authority and growing anxiety about divine protection for a dynasty that seemed increasingly vulnerable to external control. The mourning ceremonies in sacred precincts from Memphis to Philae included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's cosmic responsibilities, alongside newer supplications for divine guidance in preserving Egyptian independence under circumstances that tested the theological foundations of royal legitimacy. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets revealed both the continuing vitality of Egyptian economic production and the growing influence of foreign merchants who possessed advantages that local traders could not match. The morning negotiations in bazaars and trading houses involved discussions about credit arrangements, shipping schedules, and market access that reflected the kingdom's declining influence over Mediterranean commerce, while also demonstrating its continuing importance as a source of essential commodities. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom struggled to prepare students for careers in a political environment that required skills their teachers had never needed to develop. Young Egyptians studying administrative procedures discovered that their training needed to address scenarios involving foreign oversight and cultural preservation that previous generations had never contemplated. Greek settlers learning Egyptian traditions found themselves maintaining customs that might provide the only continuity if political circumstances continued to deteriorate. The artistic achievements of this period demonstrated both the continued creativity of Egyptian cultural traditions and the growing external influences that challenged traditional aesthetic principles. Royal commissions included monuments that celebrated pharaonic history, while also acknowledging contemporary political realities that required diplomatic sensitivity. Egyptian artists working on palace decorations incorporated design elements that would be acceptable to Roman observers while preserving traditional motifs that embodied cultural values threatened by foreign political pressure. Foreign policy during the Middle Ptolemaic period required diplomatic skills that surpassed anything earlier rulers had needed to develop. Egyptian negotiators found themselves managing relationships with Roman officials who viewed Egypt primarily as a source of revenue and strategic advantage, while also maintaining connections with other client kingdoms that faced similar pressures from expanding Roman influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Economic policies implemented during this era reflected attempts to maintain essential governmental functions, while acknowledging that traditional revenue sources had either been compromised by foreign competition or constrained by diplomatic agreements that limited Egyptian autonomy. Royal monopolies on industries like papyrus production faced challenges from alternative suppliers who could offer Roman customers better prices and more reliable service, without the political complications that accompanied Egyptian trade relationships. The daily correspondence that reached palace administrators revealed coordination difficulties that reflected the challenges of governing a kingdom whose policies required constant consultation with foreign advisors and whose territorial integrity depended on maintaining the favor of external protectors. Communications from provincial governors described growing complications in collecting taxes and maintaining order as local populations questioned the benefits of continued loyalty to rulers who seemed increasingly unable to provide effective protection or governance. Cultural developments during this period reflected both the resilience of Egyptian intellectual traditions and the growing external pressures that challenged traditional approaches to art, literature, and scholarship. Royal patronage of cultural activities continued to support projects that maintained the kingdom's reputation as a centre of learning and creativity. But these initiatives now served primarily to preserve traditions, rather than to advance new forms of cultural expression that might influence developments throughout the Mediterranean world. Administrative innovations developed during these challenging decades demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the governmental problems facing late Ptolemaic rule, but also revealed the limitations of ancient bureaucratic systems when confronted with external oversight and diplomatic constraints that restricted traditional royal prerogatives. New procedures for tax collection and legal administration attempted to maintain efficiency while also satisfying foreign observers whose approval had become essential for the kingdom's continued independence. Military recruitment throughout the remaining Egyptian territories encountered difficulties that reflected changing popular attitudes towards service in forces whose primary mission had shifted from conquest to survival. Traditional sources of loyal soldiers in farming communities faced economic pressures that made military service less attractive, while Greek settler families sometimes preferred to seek Roman protection rather than depend on Egyptian military capabilities that appeared increasingly inadequate for defending the kingdom against serious external threats. Religious developments throughout Egypt during this period reflected both loyalty to traditional beliefs and adaptation to circumstances that required theological innovation to address questions about legitimate authority under foreign oversight. Egyptian priests maintained ancient ceremonies while also developing new interpretations of traditional teachings that could justify royal policies, requiring unprecedented cooperation with foreign powers, whose cultural values differed significantly from pharaonic traditions. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during the Middle Ptolemaic period included prayers that reflected both continued devotion to the dynasty and growing concern about the kingdom's ability to preserve the cultural synthesis that had made Egyptian civilization distinctive throughout the ancient world. Priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant territories now offered supplications for divine wisdom in maintaining traditions that seemed increasingly fragile under external political pressure and cultural influence. Yet, even as the political foundations of independent Ptolemaic rule continued to erode under pressures that no amount of diplomatic skill could permanently address, the intellectual and artistic achievements of the dynasty continued to influence cultural development throughout the Mediterranean world. The mathematical principles developed by Alexandrian scholars guided scientific progress in Rome and Athens, while the architectural innovations pioneered in Ptolemaic temples inspired builders across multiple continents long after the kingdom's political independence had been compromised by foreign intervention. The young pharaoh who walked through Alexandria's palace corridors each morning understood that his reign represented a transitional period during which the remarkable synthesis of Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition would need to adapt to challenges that threatened not just political autonomy, but cultural survival itself. The decisions made in royal councils during these decades would determine whether the achievements of 3 centuries could be preserved under circumstances that would have been incomprehensible to the dynasty's founders, as the forces of history moved inexorably toward the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the last independent pharaonic kingdom. The last independent pharaonic kingdom. The birth of Cleopatra VII in 69 BCE brought into the world a child who would become the embodiment of everything the Ptolemaic dynasty had achieved and everything it was destined to lose. In the nursery chambers of Alexandria's royal palace, Egyptian wet nurses sang ancient lullabies, while Greek tutors prepared lessons that would shape the mind of the last pharaoh. The baby who slept peacefully in her golden cradle would grow to speak 9 languages, command fleets that dominated the Mediterranean, and ultimately witness the end of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The palace where young Cleopatra spent her childhood reflected the accumulated splendor of generations, yet also revealed subtle signs of the pressures that surrounded her family's reign. In the morning hours, as servants lit the oil lamps in royal chambers, the princess would awaken to find her breakfast table laden with delicacies from across the known world. Egyptian dates and Nubian honey accompanied Greek olive oil and Roman wine, creating a meal that symbolized both the kingdom's cosmopolitan heritage and its growing dependence on foreign relationships that would define her future. The daily education that shaped Cleopatra's extraordinary intellect began before dawn in palace schoolrooms, where the finest scholars of the ancient world gathered to instruct the royal children. Egyptian priests taught hieroglyphic writing and religious traditions that connected the present dynasty to pharaonic authority, stretching back 3 millennia. Greek philosophers introduced mathematical concepts and rhetorical techniques that had made Alexandria famous throughout the Mediterranean. Roman tutors provided instruction in Latin literature and legal principles that were becoming increasingly important for anyone who hoped to navigate the complex political environment surrounding Egyptian independence. By the time most Alexandrians began their morning routines, the young princess had already spent hours mastering languages that would prove essential for her future role as Egypt's final ruler. Her facility with Egyptian dialects allowed her to communicate directly with native populations who had often felt excluded from Ptolemaic governance. Her command of Greek enabled sophisticated discussions with scholars and merchants who conducted business throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Her knowledge of Latin prepared her for negotiations with Roman officials whose favour had become crucial for the dynasty's survival. The palace courtyard where Cleopatra played as a child provided daily reminders of Egypt's diminished circumstances, despite its continuing cultural magnificence. Foreign ambassadors who had once competed for Egyptian favour now arrived with messages that resembled polite ultimatums rather than diplomatic negotiations. Roman merchants conducted business with Egyptian officials who understood that their kingdom's prosperity depended on maintaining relationships that previous generations would have found humiliating. In the harbour, visible from the palace windows, ships arrived with cargoes that demonstrated both Egypt's enduring economic importance and its growing vulnerability to external pressure. Vessels carrying Egyptian grain to Roman markets represented the kingdom's most reliable source of revenue, yet also revealed its dependence on exports that foreign powers could disrupt at will. The morning activities of dock workers and merchants reflected a commercial environment where Egyptian prosperity required constant attention to the preferences and demands of foreign customers, whose political support had become essential. The great library's scholars maintained their research during Cleopatra's youth, but their work increasingly served practical purposes that reflected the kingdom's precarious position. Morning seminars addressed questions about Roman administrative practices, Greek diplomatic traditions, and Egyptian religious customs that needed careful coordination to avoid conflicts that might trigger foreign intervention. Mathematicians calculated tribute payments and trade balances, while historians studied precedents for successful resistance to imperial expansion that might provide guidance for preserving Egyptian independence. Egyptian priests throughout the kingdom began each day with rituals that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority according to traditions that had sustained royal legitimacy for thousands of years. Yet their afternoon discussions increasingly addressed theological questions about legitimate rule under circumstances that required unprecedented cooperation with foreign powers, whose values differed dramatically from pharaonic traditions. The morning offerings in temples from Elephantine to Tanis included ancient prayers for Pharaoh's success alongside newer supplications for divine protection against external threats. Agricultural communities in the Nile Valley continued their seasonal rhythms of planting and harvesting, but farmers now worked under conditions that reflected Egypt's transformed political circumstances. Roman demands for increased grain exports coincided with reduced governmental protection for rural areas, as Egyptian military forces were concentrated around strategic positions. The morning labour in fields that had prospered under earlier Ptolemaic policies now involved careful attention to crop varieties and cultivation techniques that could maximise yields for foreign markets rather than domestic consumption. The royal court's elaborate ceremonial protocols continued during Cleopatra's childhood, but these magnificent displays now served different purposes than they had during the dynasty's golden age. Foreign visitors who attended court functions often represented superior powers rather than diplomatic equals seeking Egyptian alliance. The morning preparations for royal audiences required careful attention to protocols that could demonstrate Egyptian dignity while acknowledging political realities that constrained traditional pharaonic prerogatives. Daily life for ordinary Alexandrians during this period reflected the complex adaptations required to maintain prosperity under circumstances that differed dramatically from their grandparents' experiences. Merchants who had inherited business networks spanning multiple continents found themselves competing with foreign traders who possessed better access to credit and transportation. The morning activities in commercial districts involved negotiations that balanced traditional Egyptian business practices with new requirements imposed by international relationships beyond local control. In the palace workshops, where Egyptian craftsmen created objects that proclaimed royal magnificence, artisans adapted traditional techniques to address market demands influenced by changing political circumstances. The morning sessions in these workshops involved creating luxury goods that maintained pharaonic standards while incorporating design elements that would appeal to foreign customers, whose favour had become essential for the kingdom's economic survival. Provincial governors who remained loyal to Ptolemaic authority struggled with administrative challenges that required constant innovation under external oversight. A typical day in Memphis might begin with reports about Roman commercial activities that affected local tax collection, continue with negotiations regarding tribute payments that satisfied foreign demands, and conclude with correspondence addressing territorial disputes that reflected the kingdom's weakened negotiating position. Military preparations during Cleopatra's youth revealed the fundamental transformation of Egypt's strategic circumstances. Officers who had once planned conquest campaigns now developed defensive strategies that could protect core territories while avoiding provocations that might trigger overwhelming retaliation. Training exercises emphasized garrison duties and diplomatic protection, rather than the mobile operations that had once carried Egyptian armies across 3 continents. The princess's education included practical instruction in military affairs that reflected contemporary realities rather than historical traditions. Her tutors explained siege defense and naval tactics suitable for protecting Egypt's natural advantages, while also teaching diplomatic strategies that could preserve independence through careful negotiation rather than military confrontation. These lessons prepared her for a world where royal authority would depend more on intellectual capability than traditional pharaonic power. Legal proceedings throughout the kingdom reflected jurisdictional complexities that arose when traditional Egyptian law encountered Roman legal concepts and administrative practices. Egyptian courts applying pharaonic principles found themselves addressing disputes that involved foreign citizens claiming special privileges, while Greek tribunals struggled with cases requiring understanding of Roman law. The morning sessions in these various judicial institutions often addressed conflicts that previous generations had never needed to consider. Religious observances in temples throughout Egypt included prayers that reflected both traditional devotion to pharaonic authority and growing concern about divine protection for a dynasty facing unprecedented external pressure. The morning ceremonies in sacred precincts included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's cosmic responsibilities, alongside newer requests for divine guidance in preserving Egyptian independence under circumstances that tested theological foundations of royal legitimacy. Commercial activity in Alexandria's markets revealed the continuing vitality of Egyptian economic production alongside growing foreign influence that challenged traditional trading relationships. The morning negotiations in bazaars and merchant houses involved discussions about credit arrangements and shipping schedules that reflected the kingdom's declining control over Mediterranean commerce, while demonstrating its continuing importance as a source of essential commodities. Educational institutions throughout Egypt struggled to prepare students for careers in a political environment that required skills previous generations had never needed to develop. Young Egyptians studying administrative procedures discovered that their training needed to address scenarios involving foreign oversight and cultural preservation. Greek settlers learning Egyptian traditions found themselves maintaining customs that might provide continuity if political circumstances continued deteriorating. The artistic achievements during Cleopatra's youth demonstrated both the continued creativity of Egyptian cultural traditions and growing external influences that challenged traditional aesthetic principles. Royal commissions included monuments celebrating pharaonic history, while acknowledging contemporary political realities that required diplomatic sensitivity. Egyptian artists working on palace decorations incorporated design elements acceptable to foreign observers while preserving traditional motifs that embodied cultural values, threatened by political pressure. Foreign policy during the final decades of meaningful Ptolemaic independence required diplomatic skills that surpassed anything earlier rulers had needed to develop. Egyptian negotiators found themselves managing relationships with Roman officials, who viewed Egypt primarily as a source of revenue, while maintaining connections with other client kingdoms, facing similar pressures from expanding Roman influence throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Economic policies implemented during this era reflected attempts to maintain governmental functions while acknowledging that traditional revenue sources had been compromised by foreign competition or constrained by diplomatic agreements limiting Egyptian autonomy. Royal monopolies on industries like papyrus production faced challenges from alternative suppliers who could offer Roman customers better terms without political complications accompanying Egyptian trade relationships. Cultural developments during this period reflected both the resilience of Egyptian intellectual traditions and growing external pressures that challenged traditional approaches to art, literature, and scholarship. Royal patronage continued supporting projects that maintained the kingdom's reputation as a center of learning, but these initiatives now served primarily to preserve traditions, rather than advance new forms of cultural expression that might influence Mediterranean developments. Administrative innovations developed during these challenging decades demonstrated sophisticated understanding of governmental problems facing late Ptolemaic rule, while also revealing limitations of ancient bureaucratic systems when confronted with external oversight and diplomatic constraints restricting traditional royal prerogatives. New procedures for tax collection and legal administration attempted to maintain efficiency while satisfying foreign observers whose approval had become essential for continued independence. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during Cleopatra's childhood included prayers reflecting both devotion to the dynasty and concern about the kingdom's ability to preserve cultural synthesis that had made Egyptian civilization distinctive. Priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories now offered supplications for divine wisdom in maintaining traditions that seemed increasingly fragile under external political pressure. Yet even as political foundations of independent Ptolemaic rule continued eroding under pressures that no diplomatic skill could permanently address, the intellectual and artistic achievements of the dynasty continued influencing cultural development throughout the Mediterranean world. The mathematical principles developed by Alexandrian scholars guided scientific progress in Rome and Athens, while architectural innovations pioneered in Ptolemaic temples inspired builders across multiple continents long after the kingdom's political independence had been compromised. The young princess who walked through Alexandria's palace corridors each morning understood that her education was preparing her for challenges that would test not just her personal capabilities, but the survival of everything her ancestors had created. The lessons she learned in royal schoolrooms would need to address scenarios that earlier generations could never have imagined, as the forces of history moved toward the final confrontation that would determine whether 3 centuries of Ptolemaic achievement could survive in a world transformed by Roman ambition and Mediterranean political revolution. The ascension of Cleopatra VII to the throne in 51 BCE marked the beginning of the final act in the 3-century drama of Ptolemaic rule. At 18, she possessed an intellect sharpened by the finest education the ancient world could provide. Yet she also inherited a kingdom whose survival depended entirely on navigating the treacherous currents of Roman civil war that were reshaping the Mediterranean world. The morning routine that began each day of her reign revealed the extraordinary complexity of ruling Egypt in this twilight period. Before sunrise, scribes would arrive at her private chambers carrying correspondence that might determine the fate of her kingdom. Letters from Julius Caesar's agents competed for attention with messages from Pompey's supporters, while Egyptian priests delivered reports about unrest in Upper Egypt, and Alexandrian merchants warned of economic disruption caused by Roman political instability. In the palace council chamber where Cleopatra held her dawn conferences, advisors spoke in hushed tones about military movements that could either preserve Egyptian independence or destroy it entirely. Roman legions marched across distant battlefields while their commanders decided Egypt's future without consulting Pharaoh's wishes. The young queen's breakfast conversations involved analyzing intelligence reports about which Roman faction was gaining advantage, calculating how quickly she could shift her kingdom's allegiance without appearing treacherous to either side. The harbour below the palace had become a stage where the drama of Roman ambition played out in full view of Alexandrian citizens. Ships arrived bearing news of battles fought in Gaul, Spain and Greece that would determine whether Egypt remained nominally independent or became another Roman province. The morning activities of dock workers and merchants reflected their growing awareness that their prosperity depended less on Pharaoh's policies than on decisions made in distant Roman Senate chambers or military camps. Egyptian farmers throughout the Nile Valley continued their ancient rhythms of cultivation, yet even their daily labour was influenced by political developments beyond their understanding. Roman demands for grain shipments fluctuated, according to military requirements that changed with each battle victory or defeat. The morning work in fields from Aswan to the Delta involved calculations about crop allocation that balanced traditional Egyptian needs against export requirements imposed by whichever Roman faction currently held power. In Alexandria's markets, merchants conducted business with one eye on their ledgers and another on political developments that could transform commercial relationships overnight. A Roman victory in one theatre might open new trading opportunities, while defeats elsewhere could disrupt established networks that families had maintained for generations. The morning negotiations in bazaars and trading houses required constant attention to political intelligence, alongside traditional concerns about prices and quality. The great library's scholars maintained their research activities, but their work increasingly served urgent political purposes rather than pure intellectual pursuit. Morning seminars addressed questions about Roman administrative practices that might soon govern Egyptian territories, while historians studied precedents for client kingdoms that had successfully preserved their cultural identity under imperial oversight. Mathematicians calculated tribute payments that could satisfy Roman demands without completely bankrupting Egyptian resources. Cleopatra's personal education continued even as she governed, with tutors who understood that her survival required mastering skills no previous pharaoh had needed. Her morning lessons included instruction in Roman political customs, military strategy suitable for defensive warfare, and diplomatic techniques that could maintain Egyptian dignity while acknowledging superior Roman power. These sessions prepared her for negotiations where miscalculation could result in her kingdom's annexation or her own execution. The royal court's magnificent ceremonial displays took on new significance, as Cleopatra used traditional pharaonic splendor to impress Roman visitors who might influence imperial policy regarding Egypt. Foreign dignitaries who attended morning audiences witnessed pageantry designed to demonstrate that Egypt remained a valuable ally worthy of continued independence, rather than a conquered territory suitable for direct administration. Egyptian priests throughout the kingdom began each day with rituals that proclaimed Pharaoh's divine authority, yet their prayers increasingly requested divine intervention to preserve cosmic order against foreign influences that threatened to destroy traditions stretching back 3 millennia. The morning offerings in temples included ancient formulas about Pharaoh's sacred responsibilities, alongside desperate appeals for protection against enemies whose power seemed to exceed human resistance. Provincial governors, who maintained loyalty to Ptolemaic rule, struggled with administrative challenges that required unprecedented flexibility and innovation. A typical morning in Thebes might involve mediating between Roman tax collectors and Egyptian communities, negotiating tribute arrangements that satisfied foreign demands while preventing local rebellion, and coordinating defensive preparations for scenarios that could range from civil unrest to foreign invasion. Military affairs during Cleopatra's reign reflected the kingdom's transformation from an independent power to a client state whose forces served primarily to maintain internal order rather than project strength beyond Egyptian borders. Officers who had trained for conquest operations now developed strategies for protecting key positions while avoiding conflicts that might provide pretexts for Roman intervention. Training exercises emphasized garrison duties and crowd control, rather than the mobile campaigns that had once carried Egyptian armies across 3 continents. Daily life for ordinary Alexandrians during this period required constant adaptation to circumstances that changed with each shift in Roman political fortune. Families whose prosperity had depended on stable trade relationships found themselves adjusting to new realities, where commercial success required understanding distant political developments alongside traditional business skills. The morning routines of craftsmen, merchants, and laborers involved careful attention to news that might affect their economic prospects or personal safety. Legal proceedings throughout the kingdom reflected growing complexity as traditional Egyptian law encountered Roman legal concepts that would soon dominate judicial practices. Egyptian courts applying pharaonic principles found themselves addressing cases involving Roman citizens claiming special privileges, while Greek tribunals struggled with disputes requiring knowledge of imperial law that their training had never included. The morning sessions in these various institutions often dealt with conflicts that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Religious observances in temples throughout Egypt included ceremonies that blended traditional devotion with urgent petitions for divine protection against threats that seemed to exceed mortal capability to resist. The morning prayers in sacred precincts combined ancient formulas about Pharaoh's cosmic responsibilities with newer requests for wisdom in preserving Egyptian civilization under circumstances that tested every theological foundation of royal legitimacy. Commercial activity in markets from Alexandria to Syene revealed both the continuing vitality of Egyptian economic production and the growing influence of Roman merchants who possessed advantages local traders could not match. The morning negotiations in trading centers involved increasingly complex arrangements as Egyptian businesses adapted to commercial practices that reflected imperial rather than local preferences and requirements. Educational institutions throughout the kingdom struggled to prepare students for careers in a political environment that bore little resemblance to the circumstances that had shaped traditional curricula. Young Egyptians studying governmental procedures discovered their training needed to address scenarios involving foreign occupation and cultural preservation, while Greek settlers learning Egyptian customs found themselves maintaining traditions that might provide the only continuity if political independence disappeared entirely. The artistic achievements during Cleopatra's reign demonstrated both the continued excellence of Egyptian creative traditions and the growing external pressures that influenced aesthetic choices and cultural expression. Royal commissions included monuments celebrating pharaonic history, while also acknowledging contemporary political realities that required extreme diplomatic sensitivity in their execution and display. Foreign policy during the final years of Ptolemaic independence required diplomatic skills that transcended anything previous rulers had needed to develop. Cleopatra found herself managing relationships with Roman commanders who viewed Egypt primarily as a strategic asset and source of revenue, while also maintaining connections with other client rulers who faced similar challenges in preserving nominal autonomy under imperial oversight. Economic policies implemented during this era reflected desperate attempts to maintain governmental functions, while acknowledging that traditional revenue sources had been severely compromised by Roman demands and commercial competition. Royal monopolies on industries like papyrus production and luxury goods manufacturing faced challenges from alternative suppliers who could offer imperial customers better terms without the political complications that accompanied Egyptian trade relationships. The evening ceremonies in Alexandria's temples during Cleopatra's reign included prayers that reflected both continued devotion to pharaonic traditions and profound anxiety about the dynasty's ability to preserve the cultural synthesis that had made Egyptian civilization distinctive throughout the ancient world. Priests who had once celebrated Pharaoh's victories in distant territories now offered supplications for divine guidance in maintaining traditions that seemed increasingly vulnerable to external political pressure and cultural transformation. Yet even as the political foundations of Ptolemaic rule crumbled under pressures that no amount of personal brilliance could permanently overcome, Cleopatra's reign represented the final flowering of a civilization that had successfully blended Egyptian wisdom with Greek innovation for 3 centuries. Her intellectual achievements, diplomatic skills, and cultural patronage demonstrated that the synthesis created by her ancestors could still produce remarkable results even under the most challenging circumstances. The young queen who walked through Alexandria's palace corridors each morning understood that her reign would determine whether the remarkable achievements of Ptolemaic civilization could survive the transformation that Roman conquest would inevitably bring. The decisions made in royal councils during these final decades would influence how history remembered not just her personal story, but the entire legacy of a dynasty that had created one of the ancient world's most sophisticated and cosmopolitan civilizations. As the lighthouse of Alexandria continued to guide ships into the harbour each night, its beam illuminated waters where Roman vessels appeared with increasing frequency, carrying soldiers and administrators who would soon transform Egypt from an independent kingdom into an imperial province. The light that had once symbolized Egyptian cultural and political leadership now marked the final moments of 3 millennia of pharaonic rule, as the forces of history completed their inexorable movement toward the climactic events that would end the age of the Ptolemies and begin Egypt's long centuries as part of the Roman Empire. As the last rays of sunlight fade over Alexandria's harbour this evening, we reach the end of our journey through 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. From Ptolemy, the first's brilliant synthesis of Greek innovation and Egyptian tradition, to Cleopatra, the 7th's final desperate struggle against Roman conquest, we have witnessed the rise and fall of a dynasty that transformed the ancient world. The lighthouse that once guided ships from every corner of the Mediterranean now stands silent, its beam extinguished forever, marking the end of an extraordinary civilization that proved human ingenuity could bridge any cultural divide. Thank you for sharing this peaceful exploration of history's most fascinating royal family. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with the wisdom of ages.